All right, before we get into it today, just want to make an announcement. June 19th over at Laconia Chop Ahead and Left Hand Collective, we are putting on a bike show at Laconia, man. So check it out. It's been a while since there's been cool stuff at Laconia. Actually, the day before, the dudes at Deadbeat are putting on a show at the Hill Climbs on the 18th, and then the 19th, we got a show going on at Bardello, which is right across from the Wares Beach sign. It's going to be a small curated invited builder section, but the rest of the show is riding. So if you got a custom motorcycle, especially a chopper, make sure you come by and bring it in. Registration is from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. More information on that at chopahead.com. Or on Instagram or at Facebook. On Instagram is at chopahead or Instagram at Big Truth. On Facebook, it's Chopahead Customs with a K, facebook.com/Chopahead Customs. So we got a flyer up there. But or just go to my Instagram at Big Truth. It's there. 12 to 2 o'clock is registration. The bike show goes on until 6, and then there's an after party still there over at Bardello, right across from the Wares Beach sign at Laconia. This year, it's the 102nd anniversary of Laconia Bike Rally, so it's going to be a big one. So this show just came together. So it's a little fast and loose this year, but it's going to be cool and fun as hell. So make sure you stop by. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, just check out patreon.com/Big Truth, and there's 4 different levels of patronage there for you to help financially support the show. And shout out to all my Patreon subscribers. You guys absolutely rule. If you happen to find yourself in the unfortunate situation where you are in a motorcycle accident, the first thing you should do after you make sure everything's okay, obviously, pick yourself up, make sure nothing's broken, that you can walk, that everything's good. Make sure you get the information of the person that you were involved in the accident with. Usually the car is at fault. Just saying. I know this from experience and from all the bikes that show up here at the shop that need to get work done because they're in accidents. And then the first thing you do is call Glassman, the Glassman Injury Attorneys. They specialize in motorcycle accidents and stuff. You give them a call, easiest number in the world to remember, 617-777-7777. And that's anywhere in the United States. They got attorneys that will help you out. And these are the bulldogs. So these are the people you want to talk to. 617-777-7777 on Instagram at Gotta Get Glassman. If you need artwork, whether it's for your house, your apartment, your job, your cubicle, your garage, or just say you happen to own a tattoo shop, especially for you, listen, you got to hit up tattooflashcollective.com. They supply you tattoo flash, but also artwork from tattoo artists all around the world, prints of all sizes, whether you need a poster or a postcard, anything in between, different gradients of quality. You can get it on cheaper paper or you can get it on museum quality paper if you want to keep it forever. They have books, anything art related. Check out tattooflashcollective.com or on Instagram at tattooflashcollective. If you use the promo code Big Truth at checkout, you will get 10% off your order. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you will get even more off your order, and you need to join Patreon to get that code. So membership again has its privileges. If you are in New England, stop by my motorcycle shop, Chopahead, at 13 County Road, East Freetown, Massachusetts. If you're not local, just go to chopahead.com, and that's spelled CHOPPAHEAD. Now, online, we have parts and we have swag, so you can get some shop shirts or hoodies or whatever. We have some parts online, but the whole catalog, I can't put every part online. So if there's something you need, we are hooked up with everyone. Shoot me an email, shoot me a direct message on Instagram or all that stuff at Chopahead or at Big Truth. Give us a call, 508-995-6764. We have full brick and mortar motorcycle shop. So you come in, there's a parts counter, there's a showroom. We got riding gear, we got helmets, we got Simpson, Biltwell, Bell, Daytona. We got all kinds of helmets, and we got gloves, whatever, vests and stuff, riding gear. Then in the back, it's a full-service motorcycle shop. We do everything from oil changes to build you a full custom bike, anything in between. So whatever you need, check us out, Chopahead, full-service motorcycle shop. specializing in customs, but we do whatever. Like you need some bars for your street glide, we'll do that. You want a 60s, period correct chopper built, we'll do that. Whatever. So hit us up, chopperhead.com. For more information on the podcast, just bigtruthpodcast.com. And I invite you to hit the shop button and get some show swag. We got all kinds of merch from a merch fulfillment company. So, whether you want a t-shirt or a hoodie or tank top, summer's there, there's tank tops and stuff, men's and women's. And, or you want it to go, one of those those steel stainless cups or something, the coffee mugs, the travel mugs, whatever. We got all kinds of wacky stuff there. Get a pillow for your house. Lay your head on the Big Truth Podcast logo. I got I made one of with that alien invasion logo. I gave it to my man Ken, Chief Yellowfoot. If you remember him, he was on some of the old the original M4 and used to work here at Chopperhead. But yeah, I gave it to him as a housewarming gift. Funny stuff. But yeah, anyway, check it out, bigtruthpodcast.com. And without further ado, this is my man, Austin Picard. We're going to talk about some cult stuff. He's a in-depth researcher. He's got a podcast, and he's on a plethora of podcasts. And he's a smart guy. We tried doing this a few weeks ago, and for some reason the internet went out. I don't know if there's some powers that are listening, but they shut us down. I'm just playing. But anyway, this is going to be round 2, the redo. So keep it locked right now.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have a liftoff.
All right, we're live. Once again, we have liftoff. I want to thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Big Truth Podcast, and I'm here with my man, Austin Picard, who is a researcher and podcaster, a multi-podcast podcaster, and seems like it's growing pretty frequently where you're adding more stuff on the plate. But Austin, for people, I know a little bit about you, and for the record, we started to record an episode maybe about a month ago, and some weird glitch stuff happened that never happened before. I totally lost internet. The whole building, the whole town lost internet, and for a few hours. So we should be good tonight. But so this is take 2, and already before we even hit record, we already started launching into an episode. So I just wanted to get this going. But Austin, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and your shows, and before we get into the topic tonight, which we'll eventually we'll get over and talk a little bit about the process, Church of the Final Judgment,
Absolutely.
which is one of my favorite, and it's so dumb to say favorite, you know what I mean? But
Right.
it's like, that time frame, the mid 60s, is such an interesting time to me, and it's so wild. Even in the world of motorcycles and stuff, it was such a wild time. So I love that period of time. I wish, at some point, if everyone's like, if you go back in time, where would you go? Obviously I'd want to see, the real stuff, but my whimsical one would be to go to 66 and just walk around and see the wildness, with the biker stuff, which, had a little bit of crossover with the process and just all the wackiness of 60s culture. But before we get into that, before we get too far, because I know once we get talking, we're going to get talking, why don't you introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about your shows and how you even got down this path, you know what I mean? Because, which might be opening a can of worms, but yeah. But,
No, I just, first of all, brother, thank you so much for having me on, obviously. Anytime I have the opportunity to have a conversation like this, man, I get excited because, again, it's I started the Underclass Podcast. It was as recent as April 2023, right?
Yeah.
So that was when I started it. And basically I had just been over consuming a lot of information for a decade, and I was just kind of my mind was spinning, and I wanted desperately to have some sort of outlet where I could kind of share these ideas, but also I really, more than anything, just wanted to be able to have a conversation like this where I could sit down with another person who's objectively pursuing these interests and attempting to at least seemingly do it within an ethical framework with moral values intact, where we aren't entirely restricted by this ideological prison that's been manufactured around us to kind of really, I believe, pit us against each other to a certain extent, which is what ideological warfare is truly about in my mind, which obviously happens so very often. I think the culture war is a perfect example of that, where it's just ratcheted up and escalated at every turn, and no one seems to be able to get out of their own way and kind of pry back that mask that we are inevitably remaining on this very similar path, right? Yeah. Which is, I think, another reason why I felt entirely disenfranchised. And but then I also philosophically, I didn't even want representation anymore. Like I got to a certain extent where I just, I kind of like am philosophically opposed to the idea of collectivism in how it kind of manifests in reality and is exploited and leveraged against us. Now, clearly, I believe that there's a conceptual outline where I believe in the art of war, Sun Tzu, like know your enemy. We have a common enemy, no doubt. But I believe that collectivism is sort of a poison pill to rob us of our individual, ability to, first of all, pursue our own interests, be uniquely different. I think the individual sovereignty is more important, one of the most important things that you could attempt to pursue and achieve on a daily basis with your principles and moral values. And I think that kind of insulates you personally and your family from this sort of structured system as is, which is entirely built, in my mind, to sort of kind of force our hands into just force us into participating, right? And then that's another aspect of, at every aspect of this, I want to be able to opt out. And so that's kind of like, I very much had this sort of...
Let me ask you a question really quick. Have you begun to opt out of the United States corporation?
I've been doing my best, brother. Right? Like that's been
you know what I'm saying, right?
Oh yeah. And that's what people don't realize is the structure of government itself, right? What is government? I mean, these are questions that you have to at least attempt to answer, and I think through doing so, a whole new philosophical, conceptual, just context is revealed. And you sort of are able to now navigate the waters in a more realistic way, and you're not as at least you're not as naive and as far as on the path toward the ideological deception that has been perfectly laid and perfectly implemented and set in place to distract us.
I feel like this stuff there's a long game going on, and it seems like things are, that game is escalating. I've never before, I'm 53, right? And I've been around for a while, and I've never seen people more at war with each other in this country, like over political ideology. When at the end of the day, if you really sat down, you'd probably agree on like 80 to 90% of stuff. There's like 10% that are wedge issues that people are going bananas about. And it's like, you don't see that that's a game, and that's like a fleece. And it's like, like all, and the things that people are fighting about are not, I'm not saying they're things that don't matter, but they're not things that matter as much for the most part.
Right.
And they got people divided because you're busy fighting here when this is happening over there, but no one's looking over there because everyone's looking over here in this little small subset of things. And it's like, it's wild, the level of fleecing that's going on, and that the level of propaganda that's been kicked up, especially over the last, 5 to 7 years. Obviously there is, but there's like, you have to look for it. There's no independent media that is feeding the masses anymore.
Absolutely.
And I don't feel like it's been for a long time, but like it's getting it's been getting more wild. I think it's just it feels like these plans are escalating because they're like, oh yeah, no, this is working. Like yeah, I don't get wrapped up in all this stuff right away, but it just seems like people are just, it's like there's like been a level of brainwashing going on that has just, it's almost reaching like critical mass, because nobody is able to disconnect and take a step back and take a breath. And I think, I don't know, but when you go out in life, like everything's cool. Like, you know what I mean? For the most part, right. It's such a bananas thing. But as soon as you get on social media, you would think that there's like World War III's going on, or that there's like a civil war going on in the States right now. But, you know, culturally, maybe there is, you know, but like, you know, right. But it's a small subset of people, but with the loudest voices. Like, that's the thing about social media, is that the loudest voices are amplified, but the loudest voices are also the smallest minority in a lot of cases. Like, and it's
100%. And the level of mind manipulation, you know, that you're referencing, basically, which has been honestly implemented systematically. Like we. You know, it's a part of the social engineering, but
they've said it. Like, there's books with these plans in it, and there's books in like meeting notes and whatever. Like, you just got to look for this stuff, but none of this stuff. CNN isn't going to tell you about any of this. That's the problem. No. You know what I mean?
Exactly. That's why the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School, and then the Esalen Institute, which really just became Tavistock 2.0 in the U.S., which very much drove a lot of the counterculture at the time, which I agree with you. You had mentioned how the 60s and 70s were kind of the ideal time you would want to have experienced. I felt the exact same way. I still do, because I just grew up very much admiring the 60s and 70s counterculture. Little did I know that it was entirely manufactured by the deep state and the intelligence agency, which makes a lot of sense in hindsight. But, you know, of course, like, I idolized Jim Morrison, The Doors, you know, there were many different, just the music of that era was very much influential on me personally, and also the drug culture was extremely influential. And I think that is another aspect of the counterculture that disrupted the social fabric of the U.S. and sort of the direction that the generational youth were heading in, as well as obviously the naturally occurring anti-war movement, which were dissenting against the Vietnam War at the time, which were prioritized and targeted, by the way, and especially by the Nixon administration, which was hilarious, because when I researched Watergate, I had little knowledge of the fact that there were basically, you had members of the DC Metropolitan Police Department who shared dual loyalty to military intelligence. And they were effectively really just on the ground stormtroopers in a way, clandestine operatives in the framework of Operation Chaos, which was very much hyper operational at the time, allegedly. And so this was just like, not only were they we have CIA operatives who actually became professors at UC Berkeley, right? And things of that nature, right? Which while they were in the middle of staging clandestine domestic operations to steer the culture, but also to stage, in my mind, the sort of modern Gladio. Of course, it's not modern in this context, but this sort of Operation Gladio strategy of tension and destabilization. Yeah. And also, in many ways, like, it's just interesting to me, because you consider the fact that you had like stories of anti-war protesters during this time being targeted in DC by, like, they were passing out these officers in plain clothes, state, you know, behaving as if they are natural protesters that are kind of like obviously attempting to fit in, but still passing out like these poison pill candies, which were allegedly intended to actually kill people, right? So when you had the CIA conducting operations like this, and knowingly it was admitted that they were intending on potentially assassinating a journalist who was covering the Pakistan conflict at the time with India. It was very interesting, because they were apparently criticizing the Nixon administration for their foreign policy on that specific issue. And yes, by the way, it was E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, who were both obviously involved in the Watergate break-in, were meeting with a CIA poisons expert to discuss how they would go about poisoning and assassinating. It was a targeted assassination on a U.S. journalist for telling the truth and exposing the reality of their policy positions. And the fact that they were actually having conversation. Jack Anderson, damn it. I was trying to remember. He was a Washington Post columnist. And it's just a fascinating story because, again, it shows what they were willing to do, the extent that they were willing to go to sort of keep a lid on various issues. And of course, you have to consider Operation Mockingbird as well, which I believe is another systematic operation that never ended and has clearly, effectively, in my mind, it's obviously seemed to overshadow any real ethical standard within the context of the media itself and how they kind of operate in general and the press bubble, right? Like I'll never forget Michael Hastings, and he wrote The Operators, right? And his death is very interesting. It seems like he was about to blow the whistle on something. Who knows? He claims that, of course, people close to him also seem to have like, it just, to me, I don't buy. It seems like they were either pressured or leveraged to kind of side with this story that he was a little bit out of character, losing grip on reality, and potentially he harmed himself. But the reality of it is that he had basically exposed General Stanley McChrystal, who was a 4-star general and had run JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, and covered up the Pat Tillman friendly fire incident, which was obviously, in my mind, that was intended to. Clearly, Pat Tillman was he was kind of balking at the obviously our foreign policy and being conducted in the Iraq and Afghanistan terror wars in their infancy at the time. And he had a larger than life personality and was very much well known on the world stage due to his NFL persona, and was a great safety, all pro, I think, as well. And so I believe that he became willing to blow the whistle and essentially was friendly fired upon in a targeted assassination. It was covered up. And knowing how JSOC was operating at the time, it makes all the sense in the world. And then General Stanley McChrystal gets appointed to run the terror wars under Obama. And there was this strange, like, if you read The Operators, Michael Hastings basically gains access to the press bubble of General McChrystal. And he is allowed to, because I believe he personally knew the guy who was running the press running PR for McChrystal himself in his inner circle, Duncan something, I can't remember his name now, but he was very much like a producer involved in a lot of media. There's a lot of overlap with government officials, if you didn't know. Public relations matters a lot in terms of politicians, and which obviously are just political puppets. And another reason why I started the Underclass was what it really symbolizes in the name itself is just this. In more ways than one, I see class warfare playing out. Now, I'm no way like sympathetic toward Marxist ideology in any way, and if you speak on class warfare, people kind of put you in that category.
Automatically lump you right in with that.
But that's a false framework in my mind, because I think it's very important just to understand, right, that, but
if people don't think there's a class war going on, I don't know if you just know what we came out of from the last few years, like where there was the biggest transfer of wealth in all of human history, and 50% of all U.S. small businesses or more permanently out of business. Just pull your head out for a second, clear it, and then just take a look around. And with this episode, you might want to have a pen and pencil ready, especially if you heard a lot of this stuff. And there's going to be a lot of terms where you can start doing your own research. You know what I mean? Do some searches and whatnot. How do you go about doing your research? Because a lot of this stuff, it requires a lot of deep digging, but also requires, like, as we were talking about before we even started recording, a lot of, sifting through the bullshit and the fake stuff, or the fake layers that are either put there for sensational reasons or for just kind of hiding the truth reasons. You know what I mean? Like, false, like, let's release 30 things, 27 are false, 3 are real. So no one knows what's real and what's not. But how do you go about, what's your process for doing research for your episodes?
Man, it's probably not the best example of the most well-balanced and healthy process that you could potentially pursue, but hey, it works for me.
Like you said, you strive for objectivity, which is what people need to do. Like none of this stuff, just for people that are listening and be like, what are these motherfuckers already even talking about? This is deep stuff, and it's heavy stuff, but it's real stuff. You can start doing a search and you'll be able to find documents very easily. Like, just don't think that CNN or MSNBC or Fox is going to tell you about this. But if you start doing Google searches or Brave, maybe you should get Brave and do some searches on that. You'll start finding some stuff. Like, you're going to go down a path that is going to, blow your mind and get you really pissed off. And also, just for the record, like, I don't ever intend on hurting myself.
Right, exactly.
From what I know of Austin, I don't think he intends on hurting himself either. So, you know what I mean? Just putting that out there for the ether, you know what I mean? Like, So.
Exactly. Yeah, you almost have to at this point. I'm in the midst of because once again, like, I'm telling you right now, like, the reality of the process church overlap, how frequently it overlaps within the framework of these the most just scandalous. You just consider, like, Jeffrey McDonald murders in Fort Bragg, the Fort Bragg murders, which happened in 1969. Yep. It legitimately happened 6 months after the Manson murders took place. Yep. And seemed to sort of mimic the Manson murders in a way, which is how it was as far as the false framework. In many ways, it was sort of like, but are you aware of the Fort Bragg murders and Jeffrey McDonald? Because that is such a fascinating story.
Yeah. I have I've listened to like a podcast that's talked about it type of stuff. I haven't dug deep into it, but right. and that's like one of like I said, the interest and stuff with the process church is like I don't know how much of it is real or not, but like there's like characters like Manson that can be connected to it, Son of Sam that can be connected, even like Henry Lee Lucas. Like, it's such a bizarre cult because like, and I'll let you get into, kind of going through it, but, just like their whole thing, like this, like weird kind of like coming out of Scientology and then like this post-Gnostic stuff. And then like, if you were in the cult, you could choose whether you were like what God you wanted to kind of follow. Like, it was like, you could be like with Yeshua or like Lucifer or like, it just was like, you know what I mean? And so there's like cults within the cult and, and it just got out of control. And, it's just a very intriguing, thing. But I didn't mean to cut you off, but like you were going to talk a little bit about before we jump right in the process, unless you want to just jump right into it. I'm just personally interested in your and it's not to put you on the spot, but like, I think it would be helpful to people to know a little bit how you do your research. Cause like people getting into this might be like, how do I sift through all this shit? And how do I know what's real and what's not? And it's overwhelming, and I've been listening to this stuff like, and I think, for what it's worth, and I know everyone has opinions on Alex Jones and whatever happened with Alex Jones and where he's gone, but when he came up with the word InfoWars, like the name InfoWars, it's like perfect. Like there's not a more perfect name for this type of stuff because that's 110% absolutely what it is. It's not, I mean, whatever this, they may never be a ground war in America, but there's certainly InfoWars has been going on for a long time. And I used to listen to him like 15 years ago, you know what I mean? And so I, same thing. I've been in this stuff for a long time, but for someone, who's just listening now, they might just be like, find a lot of this overwhelming or to the point where they're like, no, this is all bullshit. And it's like, nah, dude, that's the sad thing. And the scary thing is it's absolutely not like, and it's there for the finding, and you
absolutely,
can just, just look up Operation Northwoods if you don't think like the government is capable of doing any false, like any attacks on its own people, you know what I mean? Like, or just things like that. Like, I mean, and there's a million examples. I'm just throwing one out, but yeah, I mean, Go ahead. This is your episode, man. Your episode.
Yeah, good brother. I agree wholeheartedly that InfoWars I felt like it was the perfect name as well, because it perfectly embodies and just so aptly describes the current environment we reside in, right? Just this oversaturated landscape of false information, misconceptions that have been deliberately manufactured to sort of, achieve this level of deception that's honestly been unprecedented. And I think they've overachieved in many ways, as far as the social engineers and the framers of this structured system that is perfectly in place, that really kind of like, sets the stage for what could be described as modern Babylon in certain ways, because we truly are kind of ethically hollowed out in more ways than one as a society that should be. And I think that we're very desperate. And that's where you see this kind of like this subconscious desperation acting out in certain ways, where people realize this fact at a fundamental level, whether they can acknowledge it and quite, put it into realistic terms that they understand for themselves, and attempt to, let's say, at the very least, let's say just kind of like provide themselves with the sort of moral framework that can insulate them and their families from the sort of overall consequential outcome that is intended and desired, to be achieved. But truly, this is the issue that I have where like personally, how I go about my process, I just pull up as many different sources as possible on the subject material at hand, and I sift through as much of it as I can, legitimately can. Like where I will sit at my computer for up to, it's very unhealthy, at times it's over 12 hours. I'll just be like legitimately pursuing one line of interest on a certain case that will lead me down this path of a rabbit hole that's overlapping threads of credible evidence that's corroborated here and there. And you have to kind of like consistently, I'll have like, man, just as many tabs open as possible. But again, you have to like, I always attempt to see if any books have been written about the subjects as well, because you typically will have some that will either, provide the false narrative. Usually there are both, right? You'll have some that provide the false narrative and reinforce this narrative in the public mindset and consciousness. And then you kind of have the reactionary publications that don't get as much traction typically, and will more often than not be at the very least effectively memory hold within the context of attempting to research these. For example, The List is this very important book on the Atlanta child murders by Chet Dettlinger, who was an investigator on the case, and actually was even employed by the parents of the victims at a certain point in time, and was even had basically been employed by the defense as well, and which was Wayne Williams' defense at the time for the Atlanta child murders. But it's very interesting because you had insider investigators who were attempting to blow the whistle, who were claiming that there were so many other victims and perpetrators that were legitimately, should have been pursued within the framework of the task force that was formed to investigate this. But when the federal agents at the FBI were brought in, that they very much disrupted. And again, you had, this is a larger network you're considering. So you had political individuals that had held political power that were compromised within the framework of the network themselves, who were helping facilitate the cover up at a federal level. So whenever you have these examples, again, it's like this book is almost $200 just to buy this one book, to attempt to get a proper conceptual understanding and outline of what really took place in Atlanta, right, during the child murders between 79 and 81. And it's just like,
I'm not trying to cut you off here, but it seems like they do that a lot when there's a book that can really shed the light on a subject. You look, and if you got to try to go to Amazon or something, that book's like $500 or $200.
Paywall.
Keep people out of, not a lot of people are going to drop $200 on a book unless they're doing some research on that particular topic. And it's like, exactly. Is it like they're doing that on purpose? Like, you know, like obviously if you search out enough, you can probably find like a PDF online or something. But yeah, I mean, it's wild that happens a lot. It's not like that's one isolated thing where that's a $200 book, but that's just one way they try and keep information out of people's hands. Like you said, paywall, you know?
Same thing happened with, when I was researching Hitler as well, right? Because I was doing research on Hitler potentially being a mind-controlled male prostitute in Vienna in 1907 to 1914, and I was like, "Whoa, is this possible?" Right? And it's possible. Let me tell you that much. Or it could be Jewish propaganda that claims that there was a radical thread of homosexuality going through the SS Reich, right? Yeah. Which is kind of hilarious, but. Homosexual Hitlerism. It's just we were talking about it on Already Dead, and I was like, imagine being the Jewish social engineer, right, that was in charge of the Hitler mind-controlled male prostitute propaganda. Yeah. But still, I will say that there seems to be far more corroborated, credible evidence that actually proves that is a possibility. Yeah. And that even, you know, Trotsky and you had I mean,
he was a struggling artist, you know, he had to make money somehow.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, we're talking mind control manuals, and then you consider his time at Pacewalk, where allegedly the doctor, the psychiatrist who hypnotized Hitler, and basically when he was at Pacewalk, he effectively started hearing a voice, right? And it was very interesting. It's a fascinating story, but it does seem as if potentially there's some sort of mind manipulation that occurred at that time, which makes a lot of sense, because if you consider the fact that, in my mind, I think that all of history at this point is in question. Yeah. We truly do need to reflect upon all recorded history, and just like, I believe, I can't remember, it was Napoleon, I believe, who said history is just a lie agreed upon. Yeah. And I just absolutely, there's nothing that rings more true to me, because I personally even think that, I believe that I've read that, honestly, even the foundation of America was sort of a Rosicrucian mission, and far more in line with the esoteric nature of secret societies and these powerful fraternal organizations that truly seem to really kind of consolidate what we view as the deep state, honestly, at this point, which are just the puppet masters behind the very thick drawn curtain, keeping the vast majority of society in the dark, right? Yeah. So where they are the vanguards of the secret knowledge. And so we are kind of left like wandering through this again, oversaturated landscape, which very much seems to be built on diabolical deception. Yeah. And yeah.
It's like, so personally, was there just a big string of coincidences and then people taking advantage of situations, or was it like a mapped out long-term, you know what I mean? Long game, like plan, right. You know what I mean? And it's like,
man,
it's probably a little of both, you know what I mean? Or a lot of both.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's a lot of both, but I do also think that there was a tipping point that occurred where more and more power was sort of galvanized, and this new age structure really started to take form. And I think now we're witnessing the pivot where, again, they've overachieved and they're sort of streamlining and heading very, very rapidly in this totalitarian dystopian direction. Yeah, that I think will obviously incorporate, just the framework of the technocratic state. What is the technocracy?
Yeah, and the thing is, right, like, people are going to be like, oh, these guys are just talking some weird bullshit. If you are like of a certain, if you're 20, I can't really help you with this. But if you're like 30 or 40 or 50, look at what life is like now versus what it, like the freedoms I had when I was a teenager, Like you couldn't get away with half the shit I got away with when I was a kid, right? Like, right. And the freedoms that were in place just then. And, you know, I talked to my father and I'm like, what was it like when you were a kid or whatever? And it's like, bro, like just in the last 50 years, the amount of control that's been taken is bananas in America. And like, I'm sure, you know, it's worse or, you know, or comparable in, you know, other countries, but just in our lifetime, like, you know, or the lifetime of our parents, like the amount of freedom that's been lost, the amount of growth of government overreach and government control and government seizure is mind blowing. You know what I mean? And it's like, no one thinks about it because they're keeping us too busy and too distracted with like a bunch of shit day to day, like an overindulged and overindulged is a good word with bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, I don't care about the Diddy trial or, to a certain extent, you know, with the trafficking, right. You know, but like, I don't care about this. Like the dumbest shit is getting brought and thrown in our face all day to keep you distracted from the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. Like you said, and I know we're kind of bouncing around because we can talk. Right. And I know the listeners are like, what, you know, like some, you know, what
are they talking about? Yeah.
But, you know, like I said, everybody, if this is new to some of you, just use this as a starting point and look up some of these keywords that Austin's saying, like, because there's plenty out there for it. But yeah, so this all started when we were talking about your research process. So it's like, yeah, man, you got to look at things objectively. Try and remove yourself from any preconceived, you know, notions you have about things, or we all have internal bias. You got to try and free yourself of that, and just try and look at things objectively. And when you look at things objectively and with a clearer head, like, you can see that there's, you know, something's going on. Like you said, things are like ethically and morally and even spiritually, like I'll say, I'm not like a big religious guy, bankrupt at this point. And it's for a reason, you know what I mean? Like, and it's right. To advance. And it's like with AI and all this stuff coming down the pipeline, like, yeah, the technocracy is real. And like the totalitarian end game of that is, you know, is coming upon us faster than, like I said, they're ahead of schedule. And,
Absolutely.
And that's probably why there's a little bit of like weirdness with everything. 'Cause they're probably trying to, you know, get their heads around like the next steps because they're ahead of schedule with
Absolutely. But I think we have to deal in nuance as well, which obviously, you know, that's what you're alluding to, which not everything is as easily explained in black and white terms. We kind of permanently reside in the gray zone. I'm not acting as if there aren't clear ethical lines to draw in the sand with you know, individual circumstances, but I'm only, you know, obviously alluding to the reality of the fact that when peeling back the layers of manipulation, it's far more sophisticated for the average person to wrap their mind around it. And I think that is where it's kind of ignorance is bliss to a certain extent, or it's far easier to dismiss at face value because of the extraordinary, let's say the extraordinary nature of the allegations being made. That happens so very often, right? Yeah. That if you kind of bury the lead in the context of, right, just providing the, you know, let's say the conspiratorial outcome before you kind of, before you kind of like provide the credible evidence that is necessary to really kind of again convince anyone who isn't already overexposed to a lot of this information. That's where I realized, like, you know, personally, where I am at, I never expected to be, like, just kind of philosophically. In no way did I realize that I would be kind of drawn into certain aspects of investigation in certain cases that I had no real conceptual knowledge, had an overlapping, you know, like, here's a great example. I did a Jonestown episode quite some time ago.
Yeah.
And I've covered it at a very deep level. And I just now recently rediscovered this individual named Rabbi Maurice Davis. And this guy is apparently, he's a direct connection to sort of what was being conducted at the time was this really, he's kind of like a Jolly West, right? Where he's Sidney Gottlieb's basically MK Ultra deprogrammer, which I found very interesting. I had no idea that this individual was so directly tied into what was happening within this anti-cult network that was being set up, which was apparently kind of the reaction to MK Ultra being driven underground. A lot of these occult organizations propping up out of thin air. Now, I'm not saying some of them didn't naturally occur based on occult ideology and esoteric belief systems, but I do believe there is at least a very legitimate and credible claim to be made that a significant amount of these organizations and occult organizations were legitimately created out of whole cloth by intelligence agents or assets at the very least. But definitely, I think an L. Ron Hubbard, a Michael Aquino, the individuals, even Aleister Crowley, right? You really consider that MI5, right? In my mind, as far as the legitimate psychological warfare engineer, effectively, he definitely was an operative. And so when you kind of realize that all of these occult organizations were kind of, again, propping up around the time that MK Ultra was driven underground during the false transparency being at least presented to the public in the form of the church committee hearings and the things of that nature. That is mind-blowing stuff when you begin to realize the legitimate consequences of this playing out and manifesting in reality, which were basically these isolated test groups for MK Ultra that were being sadistically set up domestically in the jungles of Guyana, let's say. Right? Where you can take a massive group of African Americans who are legitimately extremely lower class, at least a lot of them were brought in just from, they had in Mendocino County, I believe is where it was, where Jim Jones had access to, the welfare office, where he was basically just in charge of all the welfare checks that were coming in from the members of the People's Temple, because he would have them all sign over everything that they owned to him. So they would, for room and board at the time before they ever left Ukiah, which is Northern California, right? Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. But this guy, I just discovered, this is crazy, brother, because Jim Jones has a connection to David Berkowitz and the Process Church in Atlanta, which I had no idea.
I didn't know about this one. I didn't know. What's the connection?
All right. So you have this guy by the name of Billy Dan Parker. Okay. And this is crazy stuff because this woman by the name of, I believe her name was, let me pull it up here, Shirley McGill. That was her name, because she was a criminal informant and a witness. And she basically provided the satanic cult connection to the Atlanta child murders through her boyfriend, Parnell Traham was his name. But it's interesting because Billy Dan Parker, basically this is an excerpt from a 1982 investigative report on the Atlanta child murders that stated that Shirley McGill identified Billy Dan Parker, as a member of the Atlanta cult named the White Bill. That's what they called him. And Rabbi Maurice Davis, whose history involves being a chaplain at the NIMH Addiction Center in Lexington, Kentucky, which has now since been identified as a clear MK Ultra front. He was the rabbi in Indianapolis who was the first sponsor of Jim Jones in the early days of the People's Temple, and was a rabbi in Westchester, Connecticut, or in Westchester County, New York, with the Son of Sam murders occurring while he resided there. He turns to the anti-cult activist through this organization, Citizens Engaged in Reuniting Families, CERF. This is mind-blowing stuff because now you have this insane ADL connection to the Anti-Defamation League, which makes all the sense in the world if you consider just after modern day connections, right? To a lot of these psyops being conducted in front of our eyes. Think about the Jewish diplomats who were just assassinated and targeted in DC. What happens directly after that? You have the direct authority, and that's essentially I forget his role at the ADL, but he's very much involved at the highest level. He comes out calling for obviously social media censorship, so more First Amendment violations, utilizing anti-Semitism as a justification to violate free speech rights is truly what is happening. Now, it's interesting because the ADL, it seems as if, there's this documented instance of ADL involvement in the early 60s when Rabbi Maurice Davis participated in MK Ultra. And this is interesting because apparently Davis' co-workers at the time, all of this was happening while he was a chaplain at the Kentucky Lexington Addiction Research Center.
What was his involvement? Like, what level of involvement did he have with MK Ultra? What was he?
They're saying that he directly worked at the behest of Sidney Gottlieb, right? Okay. The CIA's chief chemist, who was I believe they called him the dark sorcerer of MK Ultra. He was the direct, perpetrator who was legitimately conducting, I believe, the umbrella operation, which clearly there are so many sub-projects of MK Ultra. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, even Monarch itself, you can get into so many different levels of what was being conducted.
Yeah.
Trauma-based mind control.
And you get into Manson, was it Midnight Sun or something like that?
Oh, man. Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah. And Operation Midnight Climax.
Midnight Climax.
Yeah. Dawson, Johns.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I'm telling you, buddy,
like a lot of these famous, infamous people don't come out of nowhere is what we're saying here. You know what I mean? There's a structure behind them to get them to the point where they get this level of infamy, And,
you know what? I've been describing it as program to patsy lately because, right, obviously Dave McGowan's great book, Program to Kill.
Yeah.
It truly does seem as if the vast majority of these serial killers, it's so similar to, it almost mimics the Satanic Panic, this alleged mass hysteria that was not based in reality, when all you can do is point to corroborated, credible evidence of legitimate satanic ritual abuse taking place. Even McMartin, that people like to dismiss. Man, it was far more than McMartin. There were so many other preschools and child care organizations that were implicated and involved at that level of child sex trafficking and pornography. It's terrible stuff. And, this is where you have like the urban myths, alleged myths that, where the people don't believe in snuff films. Like, that's how it was presented to the public for how long? I mean, for far too long. And I mean, it was like 8 millimeter, that Nicolas Cage movie went in like 1999. I didn't even realize that had kind of provided the introduction to at least conceptually to the public. I think is of vital importance, because at the very least, as much as I think Hollywood is leveraged and exploited against us, I think at times there are examples of it actually providing a legitimate, necessary concept that otherwise has been entirely dismissed at face value by the vast majority of the public due to social engineering and things of that nature. And just I would have to imagine just the naive unwillingness to just not want to effectively embrace reality that is as dark as that, right? Which I think there are many people who just would rather not know.
Yeah, who wants to think that there's these fucking monsters out there? Yeah. In not only. Oh, everyone thinks that, there's monsters out there, but they're like in the seedy gutters of like New York City. I'm like, they're also in the high rises, and they're also in the state house of, you know what I mean, of these places. They're not, it's like these people can't exist in just a pure underground sense, like without some support from, from higher levels,
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but I'm just trying to put things in context for people who might be like, "What the fuck are these guys going on about?"
For sure.
But yeah, so we were talking about like so I didn't realize that that's wild that there's a Jim Jones overlap with the Process. So,
I'm telling you.
So just for people who aren't familiar, the Process Church of the Final Judgment was a cult that came about in the 60s. It started in England and then spread, and they had some interesting kind of. It was two people, Mary and with John, that had met, and they were Scientologists, and then they went rogue from Scientology, which then is the connection to L. Ron Hubbard, and then which you can connect to like Jack Parsons and people like that, and just again, 60s
was
right?
a wild time. Marianne McLean. and Robert de Grimston were personal friends of L. Ron Hubbard before they had a falling out.
Yeah.
And then they decided that they had a disagreement and they would start their own process.
Yeah.
But in reality, the Process Church seems like, I don't know, I've even read it described as like the strong arm of Scientology, which I found to be very interesting because they, attempt to kind of like distance themselves from Scientology in a way. But there are all of these direct, obvious connections, even like Thomas Jude Baumler, who obviously was, he founded Discordianism and is another perfect example of, I believe it was Jim Garrison, right, who was investigating the JFK assassination. Yeah. He tracked down the fact that Thomas Jude Baumler was, if you're Thomas Jude Baumler is actually the individual who found he incorporated the process in Louisiana, which I thought was very interesting. But once you realize that you have this Kerry Thornley, right? Which Kerry Thornley is such a crazy story. He's the individual who actually founded Discordianism. I misspoke there about Thomas Jude Baumler because I forgot about the fact that was the direct connection Tommy Baumler had with Kerry Thornley when he was in Louisiana. Apparently, Kerry Thornley was technically a member of the Process Church and was personal friends with Thomas Jude Baumler, who helped incorporated the process in Louisiana. But it's interesting because they were clearly involved in the JFK assassination. Kerry Thornley himself worked out of Guy Bannister's office at the same time as Lee Harvey Oswald and was implicated and named by Jim Garrison as being one of Oswald's impersonators at the time. And if you look up Kerry Thornley, you discover the fact that he he wrote this book called The Idle Warriors, which is it's very interesting because it's literally it's supposed to be a fictional novel, but it's in 1962. It's just before the assassination of JFK in 1963. And what does this book actually describe? It describes what seems to be this very interesting individual that perfectly embodies that of Lee Harvey Oswald and the path that he took within the framework of covert operations, which Jim Garrison said Kerry Thornley was running covert operations domestically with Oswald in New Orleans. And so The Idle Warriors, this novel written by Thornley in 1962, was about a disgruntled Marine who defects to the Soviet Union and was based on Thornley's knowledge of Oswald. He was actually, it's just so interesting because the following year is when Thornley moved to New Orleans, where, of course, he then worked out of Guy Bannister's office with David Ferry and Clay Shaw. And so, David Ferry was, I believe, sexually, assaulting and molesting. He was effectively hypnotizing members of the Civil Air Patrol in Louisiana, which was Lee Harvey Oswald and Barry Seal were a part of David Ferry's Civil Air Patrol unit. And understanding that, I believe there's this strange homosexual underground that was playing out at the time that seems to be very much involved with a lot of the well-established networks of pedophilia as well. I'm not entirely certain why they coexist so directly at this time, but it seems as if they did. I mean, Guy Bannister and Clay Shaw, Clay Shaw was legitimately a homosexual. So was David Ferry. Many of these covert operatives who were later kind of, hung out to dry in the context of the domestic operations playing out at the time. At the very least, they were overexposed by just honest, integral investigators who were seemingly, refusing to kind of take no for an answer and put aside their, legitimate interest in finding the truth. And that's why I thought, at the very least, Jim Garrison attempted to really provide us with a legitimate narrative that breaks down the JFK assassination at a level that I honestly don't understand how people claim we don't know what happened to JFK. It's like it very much seems as if it was a killing of the king ritual conducted in broad daylight in 1963 to say this is what we're capable of. And you're not going to even know who did it because the power cabal will remain in place.
Yeah. And if you want evidence of the power cabal remaining in place, JFK files still not fully released, somewhat released.
Okay.
They still haven't released the Epstein list, even though they said they were gonna. But why do you think that is, right? It's like that's not coming out. Like all they do is say, "Oh no, we have new information. We can now prove that he actually did kill himself and it wasn't someone else."
Yeah. AI generated.
Cool story, bro. Now put the fucking list out, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
It's like no one cares how he actually died at this point. Let's see that list,
Right.
And it's like,
and even that, it's like it's kind of a misnomer how it's all been, kind of like presented to the public in the first place, because it's like it was Nick Bryant, I believe, who had the original Black Book, the original copy that was published in Gawker.
Yeah,
and it's that I believe the Black Book was actually Ghislaine's contact, as far as her address book, essentially, and had a list of contact numbers.
Yeah, so you don't know who's an actual client versus who's just a contact. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. But even then, it's interesting because it does seem as if, just like a Mark Dutroux, just like a Wayne Williams, just like a John Wayne Gacy, there are honestly endless examples, right? Like you just, you kind of see this fall. Who was the first example that I was just discussing? Because I lost it in the context of providing all the other examples. What were we just talking about? I know. I fucked up, dude.
Wait, what were we just talking about? When? Like it changed every 30 seconds.
Damn it, man. Damn it. I had somewhere I was going. Son of a bitch.
It's tough. It's tough because there's so much going on, and there's so, like you said, there's overlap, and these same names come up in so many different contexts. This guy is here, but he's also here, and he's here then, and then he's over here. You know what I mean? And it's like,
right.
No,
but and David Berkowitz as well. Like each and every one of them provide a perfect example of essentially a patsy who, is low-hanging fruit. That was the goal. Epstein.
Yeah.
We had just brought up Epstein.
Yeah.
So I was essentially just trying to kind of just illustrate the fact that obviously he was much more of low-hanging fruit than, in terms of the network itself. I think he was middle management. I think Ghislaine Maxwell was essentially his handler in many ways, and that and his connection to Robert Maxwell, obviously, which was obviously you have this interesting overlapping reality of a dual operative. Not only is he a double agent in the terms of, operating with the Mossad and Russian intelligence, but he's being leveraged as an asset for the CIA as well. So I think that this is a perfect example of like the international intelligence construct, this network in place that was kind of post World War II, that it was firmly implemented. And I think that Gladio very much helped with this, the stay behind networks, after kind of implementing the rat lines of the Nazi rat lines, where they fled to safe havens all throughout the world, right? And the Nazi drafts were taking place, and Operation Paperclip happened, and the Russians and the U.S. decided which Nazis were more valuable than the others. And it was the Nuremberg trials were a huge joke. I forget it was.
Yeah, it was like they threw a couple of low hanging fruit. They throw some low hanging fruit out there to pay the price, where all like the major players, got high level jobs in different countries, different governments throughout the world. Especially mostly us in Russia, but it's just like,
Warner von Braun didn't even get a new identity.
No,
they just didn't even care.
Like, oh, you're gonna head up NASA. You know what I mean? Like, you're gonna make rockets for us. Yeah.
Right. And how crazy. He was legitimately going to concentration camps and choosing. He was pointing out which Jewish slaves weren't apparently working at a fast enough pace, and they were then sort of hung and crucified in the for all to see within the rest of the warehouse of that very specific concentration camp. I've read specific examples of this. It's crazy stuff. I couldn't believe that he was that directly involved. Not only was he going to check in on, the manufacturing aspect of the rocket propulsion systems that he was having, right, the slave labor attempt to manufacture. He was also very much involved in the actual, punishment, which was being conducted. So, he was legitimately a sadistic sociopath. But I do find it interesting that he provided a biblical verse on his tombstone that said, "The firmament showeth his handiwork." And I always found that interesting because obviously, if you're running the rocket propulsion, what was it, NASA, but you consider JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and kind of their.
Here comes Parsons again, yeah.
Exactly, direct connections to the occult.
Yeah,
you kind of realize that even the moon landing itself, right? The mission, the Apollo moon missions, like we're sort of like a fertility ritual in a way, right? The penetration of this phallic object into, right? It's very interesting. If you actually look at the symbolism in itself, it is legitimately a fertility ritual. It's very interesting. But I've heard it described in much more descriptive terms that provide a little bit of a better example of to how that is possible. But it convinced me that it definitely was, at the very least, certain individuals were practicing that esoteric philosophy during the Apollo missions. And again, I think the moon missions were effectively filmed at Lookout Mountain Laboratory in Laurel Canyon, but that's just my personal opinion, right?
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
If you look into what was being conducted in Laurel Canyon at Lookout Mountain Laboratory, because that was just like the hub of covert operations for quite some time. And even the original atomic tests were filmed out of Lookout Mountain Laboratory, at least produced out of Lookout Mountain Laboratory. So, and that's the one where they have missing frames, where like the car is parked behind the building, then it's not there.
Not there. Yeah.
It's very
all kinds of wacky stuff. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it would, if you don't think there's occult ties to all this stuff, just do a quick Google search on Jack Parsons, and you'll see that he was involved heavily in the OTO, was a friend of Alistair, or not only a friend, but basically not an intern. I'm trying to think of the word in that sense of Aleister Crowley.
Protege.
You know what I mean? Yeah, protege. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for. And a contemporary and a colleague. And like he was Crowley's, guy in the United States, basically, or the California.
Didn't he run the Pasadena Lodge?
He did of OTO.
He had a falling out, I believe, with Crowley. Is allegedly what happened, right?
Yeah,
is that he had a falling out, or at the very least they had a disagreement, and he was removed from the lodge.
Yeah,
basically is what happened. But yeah, you look up the Babylon working. Come on. Right.
Yeah. This guy was writing. Yeah. He was writing rituals and doing rituals. He was trying to raise the Antichrist. You know what I mean? And at the same time, he was the head of JPL, and he was working with NASA to develop rockets, and and he was working with Werner von Braun, was trying to get access to Werner von Braun at least. You know what I mean? And it's just all these guys, this is why the 60s was such a weird time. You know what I mean? Too, you know what I mean? It's just wacky. You know what I mean? But
and the Babylon working, these rituals, right, where he and L. Ron Hubbard are in the desert, jerking off on tablets, essentially.
But this guy's also one of the most important rocket scientists at the same time. It wasn't like he got weird. It was he was weird the whole time, the whole time. And,
I read this crazy. There's this JStorage article about, they called it Sex Cult Rocket Man. And it's crazy because it talks about how there was basically this trio of young founders of JPL. And basically they called themselves the Suicide Squad.
Yeah.
And it's an insane story. But as far as the 1946 Babylon working, that blew my mind because you're talking about an attempted manifestation of the divine feminine.
Yep.
This legitimate occult archetype, within the context of Thelema.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about just the transformative reality of what we were discussing earlier of modern Babylon, this is what the blending of these esoteric elements truly becomes, right? It's like, this is the new esoteric, new age ideological framework of control is how I've kind of like conceptualized it personally. And it does seem like that is truly what is taking place here in many ways. And you look at, like, there's this crazy, their Hermetic library basically discusses this to a certain extent and talks about the conception of, the Babylon working. But the fact of the matter is that it really explains about how the goddess, right, essentially was the force, really force called Babylon is what it really is. It's like it's truly more than a deity. It's very interesting. It's ushering in the new age in many ways. And this is like the age of Aquarius, the Aeon of Horus, I believe is another way that it's been described. Yeah. It's fascinating stuff, man. But it's all legitimately drenched in occultism. And by the way, there's this crazy story that every time I think of the JPL and Jack Parsons, I think of this story that the Python Cowboy told on Joe Rogan. Have you ever seen that?
I didn't see that one.
It's so crazy, man. It's so I usually like only I'll watch Rogan whenever he has MMA fighters on, or like there's just some strange obscure guest that I randomly will come across and I have time. And this was one of them a while back, called the Python Cowboy. And he was like this conservationist that hunts pythons in the Everglades. And it was a crazy episode, but like over halfway through, they get into this conversation about how he was hunting these pythons in the remote location in the Florida Everglades, where he had to receive, like, essentially he had to receive like legitimate. This was a former black site where NASA had a facility during the Cold War, and this is where apparently Jack Parsons has a direct connection to holding occult rituals at this specific facility in the Florida Everglades, which was technically a black site where the JPL was manufacturing their propulsion systems, which I found very interesting that was being conducted during the Cold War. Obviously it was. Yeah. But still, this guy, Mike Kimmel, all right, I believe is the Python Cowboy. He shows up and he starts to explain how basically he's out in the Everglades and he comes across this infamous abandoned Aerojet rocket test facility. And this was in April of 2019. And essentially what he discovers is that there are these upside down crosses, right, that are stuck on this giant rock pile. And you have red paint with like graffiti that was basically written in Latin. And essentially what happens is that you can see this as you climb up the rock pile. There's a small scarlet snake that's wrapped around the neck of a baby doll. And I believe it was the left eye of the baby doll that was like damaged. I'm trying to get another picture of it, but either way, I think that matters because again, it's like in the context of the Process Church, I found out that Bill Mincer was basically he was a bodyguard for Larry Flint, the Hustler magazine publisher. Yeah. This is crazy stuff because it turns out that apparently Bill Mincer was referred to as Manson 2, right? And it was interesting because he definitely was a trusted bodyguard for Larry Flint, who was a pornography publisher and the founder of Hustler magazine. But it's interesting because he also was the hitman who was employed to murder Roy Radin, who was a producer, right?
Larry Flint or the bodyguard?
The bodyguard of Larry Flint.
Okay,
yeah. Right. But they're all affiliated with this underground, essentially this underground network of not only pornography, but legitimately going into occult rituals where you're having like ritualistic murder for the use and purpose of snuff films for an enterprise, which this is realistic and it consistently coming up now in the framework of almost every one of these investigations, I'm realizing there's even an additional layer of depravity that I was unaware of before. And again, I think if you don't know what to look for, you don't quite have the pattern recognition that you've kind of like, at the very least, armed yourself with the tools psychologically to I think know exactly what you're attempting to look for. And I don't always know, but I'm just saying that once you see the pattern, it's almost impossible not to obviously recognize it when you come across it. And so still, the fact of the matter is, right, this individual who William Mincer is Manson too is apparently involved in these snuff films and was a hitman who legitimately executed Roy Radin, and it was called the Cotton Club murders, right? And the whole point that I was attempting to make is basically that I am not at all surprised that the left eye was taken from the baby doll, because if it were actually an occult ritual, then this would make all the sense in the world in the context of the left eye. And it's another reason why 13 shots happened when Roy Radin was executed in specific areas of the body, because 13 was specifically an occult reference. And this is all symbolic in the aspect of the philosophy and occult doctrine that is being practiced by the individuals who are conducting the ritual murders. Yeah. So targeted assassinations, the same thing happened in the Stacy Moskowitz killing, in the David Berkowitz murders, in the Son of Sam case. They were just outside of I believe that was the one where they were just outside of a nightclub. The nightclub itself was an occult. Oh man, I'm trying to remember the name of the nightclub. Hold on, let me see if I can pull it up. It's very interesting because the nightclub that Stacy Moskowitz was killed at, I believe that was it had an occult name, and it's very interesting because it was purposely done in the context of an occult ritual killing. It's basically a sacrifice on an occult holiday, and so it happened around. There were killings that occurred in Son of Sam around Valentine's Day as well, which was definitely it's a known occult holiday.
And Berkowitz was like, had ties to a cult group, the Children, which was they think some kind of process offshoot, right? Was that, and then also when you bring up snuff films, like Berkowitz talks about, like some of the killings were filmed for that explicit purpose. To produce a snuff film out of, or at least some kind of, killing film. You're like, I don't, right. People differ on the term, like what constitutes a snuff film. Like they differ. Obviously you've seen things like like when they behead the journalist, in overseas, or like that's right. It's not really it's showing a killing on film, but it's not the context of what a snuff film is, right? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's I kind of like.
We're in some dark waters here, by the way. We're in some really dark waters here, by the way.
Yeah, I apologize. This is legitimately.
All right. It's all right.
I need to pivot after I do this next upcoming solo project of the Atlanta child murders, because again, what happened is I think I fell victim to the reality of the Process Church and the fact that once you can consistently tie this organization into these extraordinary scandals all throughout modern and recent history that seem to have like massive implications of sort of misdirecting just culture in general. It's like it has a huge impact. It seemingly does in every way, and becomes a major focus. And
a quick question. Just like this is like a real basic, but you've done like a lot deeper research than I have on this. Do you think that was like kind of like when Robert de Grimston and Mary like when they formed the Process Church? Do you think this was the intention, or do you think that the type of people it attracted, furthered this, or do you think that like it was co-opted? Like, you know what I mean? Like people saw this, that there was a network, that there was like a structure in place that they could use to kind of, implement these other things. Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
because it almost seems kind of silly. Like at first you had these people in black robes walking around with German shepherds handing out literature. There was like a doomsday cult, and they were trying to, influence like pop culture, and they were like trying to like ingratiate themselves with like different like celebrities of the time to like kind of further the thing. But like, do you think that was the because obviously they have a seedy past, with L. Ron Hubbard and stuff. Do you think it was set up as like some kind of front for a deeper operation, or do you think it got co-opted because they saw a structure in place?
Right. I honestly do think that from day one, there was definitely some sort of, because now here's the issue that I struggle with, because I'm not entirely certain of the level of belief that let's say a Robert de Grimston and Marianne McLean truly, practiced themselves. What was it more of an exploitation and obviously utilizing this sort of abuse of power in the context of a cult organization and being sort of deified in this framework, which de Grimston himself was sort of like the Jesus figure, and Marianne McLean was more of the deity, which I found interesting, the goddess. But still, I think that it's undeniable there's a level of intelligence as far as the intelligence organizations being affiliated with the creation of the organizations.
Yeah.
I think that feels like it has to be the case. Now, to what extent did they have a hand in creating the organization, to utilize it for what purpose? Now, I'm not entirely certain, because it seems as if they're leveraged to conduct domestic operations in many ways that are covert. And also it provides this interesting aspect of, again, the extraordinary allegations. So it's as if the average individual will come across this idea of a cult organization and dismiss it at face value, right? Because it seems so extraordinary that obviously it was a satanic panic and it was mass hysteria, and that clearly this is too extraordinary that it's unbelievable. And I think that is utilized as a tool and effectively exploited by the powers that be and the Mockingbird media assets in place to sort of facilitate the cover-ups. But to what extent? Now, I do believe that there are I would even think the majority of the actual acolytes, the practitioners of the ideology, genuinely believe in this esoteric belief system. Yeah. I mean, truly, and pushing, because again, it's like excess. And as far as the Luciferians, I believe, where they practice the excess, the widespread drug use, and
the hedonistic side.
Exactly.
And then there was the satanic side, and then there was the
Jehovah's.
The Jehovah's, yeah.
So we're like the Puritans of the sect in a way, right? And
they literally had like tests to be like which subsect are you going to go into, like crazy. And so the Jehovah's sect might not even have known what was going on with the Luciferians or the satanic side, you know what I mean?
Right.
And
exactly.
Very bizarre, because it was the three entities, right? The three entities. That they had.
Yeah, it was like three subgroups that they sort of formed the structure of the process.
Yeah,
it's very interesting stuff. But I will also say there is definitely there's a reality and credible evidence. Detective James Rothstein, who is a legitimate resource in terms of his investigation of the Process Church itself. Like, talk about ritualistic animal sacrifice. You have mass graves of Alsatian German Shepherd dogs, obviously. That I believe that I was discussing this the other day on with Operation GCD and the Occult Rejects. We were talking about how basically it's very interesting, because it seemed as if the German Shepherds were potentially utilized as and prioritized by these occult groups. Like even the Nazi SS allegedly used a loyalty test by providing you with a German Shepherd puppy that you would then raise and later on sacrifice. And this was a loyalty test to essentially, it was really trauma-based mind control.
Also, it's like a psychological break. Like, you know what I mean? If you can kill this thing that you raised, like who doesn't love a puppy that they raise other than a complete psychopath, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, but if you can kill this dog that you raised and like bonded with and wholeheartedly trusts you and loves you, like, you know, unconditionally, and then you can kill that, then what else are you capable of? Like pretty much you're a full psychopath pretty much, you know what I mean?
Right. The psychopath machine.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's what I read the book The Psychopath Machine by Steve Smith, who was a victim of at the Oak Ridge facility in Canada. And it was essentially Dr. Ewan Cameron and his outsourced MK Ultra of the Montreal experiments being conducted. And essentially what were they doing? They had set up a legitimate mind control operation in Oak Ridge, and it had a sister facility as well with strictly females involved, where basically you had a program set up by Dr. Barker was his name. And he effectively was attempting to isolate and identify sociopathic tendencies in individuals, because he realized that they were far easier to program to become useful psychopaths.
Yeah.
And because he said clearly through his research that he conducted, he could effectively create a psychopath out of whole cloth, essentially, who didn't show these characteristics and traits inherently, but it was far easier to just get an already preconceived psychopath who shares these characteristics, and then train them and utilize these essentially sophisticated methods to sort of just, again, you're putting in place what one of the individuals it's such a fascinating story, the Steve Smith psychopath machine, because Peter Woodcock, he's like a child murderer and rapist, and he goes to Oak Ridge, and they let him out. He goes out on a kibbutz to Israel. He's on the front lines fighting with the IDF, and then he comes back and lives on a farm with Dr. Barker, and who ran the Oak Ridge facility, and then he's back in for a life sentence because he essentially there's one of the individuals at Oak Ridge was also taken out to it hadn't been released from the facility, was already a serial murderer, hadn't been released from this facility for years and years, was taken to a movie by the administrators of Oak Ridge, taken out to a public facility, a movie theater, where he then watched Silence of the Lambs, was then released from the movie theater, where he goes down, procures a shotgun, and kills another individual who had been released from Oak Ridge years earlier, kills him in cold blood at a bus stop, and then goes back to Oak Ridge for the rest of his life to serve his life sentence. Which, when you have examples of this playing out, and you can legitimately point to the fact that you have government involvement in not only producing psychopaths, right, or recruiting psychopaths, but legitimately manufacturing and creating psychopaths, at the very least honing their skills, and then providing them with military training on the front lines of an international conflict in Rhodesia.
Yeah.
How is this possible? Right? Like, in what world could you imagine this being a reality without some sort of legitimate government influence, providing them with, the pardons necessary to then be able to go about this process, which is legitimately what happened, and it was all below board, covertly, facilitated, and later on it was exposed, but to far few people that can't quite really obviously have any real effect or can really drum up any legitimate tangible accountability that would lead to any obvious solution to some sort of process such as this, right, that has been clearly created and cultivated over time. But I don't know, man, like when you look at the process church, and you see where it consistently continues to arise, which is once again, it is not only the Helena Stokely witnesses in the Fort Bragg murders. Not only is it involved with Wayne Williams and the Parnell Traham connection with, as far as Shirley McGill as the witness providing evidence in the Atlanta child murders. Man, you also have a direct connection to Charles Manson, which we mentioned earlier.
Didn't he write a piece for one of their magazines or something? Or they used some of his? Yeah. Yeah, because they did make these, like, did you ever see any of those magazines? Like, their artwork and stuff is pretty, it's wild. You know what I mean? But what I forgot the piece that Manson wrote, but he wrote a piece. So, like, he was definitely
entitled Death.
Death. Yeah, it was for the death issue. It was the death issue. They had like a sex issue, a death issue, a love issue, Yeah. And, so I didn't mean to do the train of thought. And you said they're also Jim Jones, the connection, son of Sam. Henry Lee Lucas was one. That one seems a little soft. Like, I don't know. I haven't seen as much hard.
Well, now I'm realizing the Hand of Death was most likely an offshoot of the process.
And Henry Lee Lucas's partner there, Otis Toole was part of Hand of Death, right? And then and Henry Lee allegedly was connected to them through Otis.
Yeah, I'm beginning to realize, just as the children, right? Yeah. Consider that, right? Berkowitz, he's a part of the 22 divine disciples from hell, or the children, right? Yeah. This interesting offshoot and local chapter of the Process Church through the Magical Child occult bookstore is where they were truly kind of like originally organizing. That's how he was kind of allegedly first introduced. By the way, I just found through the course of my research on the Atlanta child murders, I just discovered this crazy story that Brother John Paul Ranieri, who's directly involved in the process, right? So check this out, because it provides another potential, at the very least, an alternative theory that makes it falls perfectly in place and provides a plausible, again, just another wrinkle in the story. But this could very well be a legitimate claim here by Brother John Paul Ranieri, who basically, if you look him up, this is, by the way, Maury Terry obviously wrote The Ultimate Evil, one of the greatest books out there, and definitely my favorite in terms of the Process Church. But according to Brother John, all right, which there was a Brother John who went and met with not only Manson and came out after the meeting with Manson during his trial with the death issue of the process, but he also, this Brother John, was listed as on the meeting list with Bugliosi, right, the prosecutor at the time, and he had gone in and left brochures from the Process magazine saying that Robert Moore, which was an alias for Robert de Grimston, he was assuring Bugliosi, the prosecutor in the Manson case, which had a huge problem with Tom O'Neill, who wrote Chaos, apparently, and clearly was sort of a part of the cover-up, at least being facilitated. But it's interesting because he apparently was assuring, when he had this meeting behind closed doors with Bugliosi, providing him with brochures of the Process Church, was assuring him that Robert de Grimston was nonviolent, right? Which I just thought was hilarious. But so then you have this Brother John Paul Ranieri, who, this is interesting because apparently he claims that the Westchester cult was spawned back in the early 1950s, courtesy of a Nazi sympathizing doctor who traveled from England to North Yonkers in the post-war years. It started as a ritual magic club that specialized in sex with children and drug dealing, and it grew from there. This is what Brother John said. Now, the heavy Satanism came later, but they were doing stuff long before Berkowitz came along. It was well organized, and they had some big connections in Yonkers and Manhattan. Brother John also spoke to the cops, the police authorities, explaining that John Carr, who obviously the Carr family were involved in the Son of Sam case and the David Berkowitz connection there, that John Carr recruited him, John Paul Ranieri, and several other adolescents into the group in 1961, when all of them were in high school as freshmen in Yonkers. and that he emotionally described how he and 3 other youths were raped during an initiation ritual in Untermeyer Park, a ceremony at which dogs were sacrificed, which that perfectly aligns with Detective Jim Rothstein, who he obviously provided the connection as the former NYPD detective, ex-head of the department's human trafficking, vice-related crimes division. He legitimately traced all of this. It was tipped off by a criminal informant that there were mass graves of German Shepherd dogs in Untermeyer Park. And so he goes to Untermeyer and he discovers the Devil's Cave.
Yeah.
And he discovers this mass grave of dogs. And it's terrible stuff, because you're seeing these abductions, these child kidnappings that are happening in Untermeyer and these affiliated parks that are nearby as well. Now, apparently, whenever the occult rituals were being conducted in the parks and various areas in the Devil's Cave, apparently when they were being conducted, even at some of the, let's say, gated communities, housing that were very nearby these parks, some of the rituals were being conducted there after the children had been procured and abducted from the nearby areas. Apparently, the biker gangs were providing security for the occult rituals as they were being conducted in the area. And so you had whistleblowers who were becoming criminal informants after they took on prison sentences. They were going to prison for huge sentences for various things. And some of these, there was one witness that came forward and provided an insane occurrence that took place as far as in context of Untermeyer Park. And it's just, once again, it boggles your mind what they were capable of legitimately doing, right? Which is a graffiti artist. It's very interesting. Going by the moniker Fuzz1, he claims that he witnessed a satanic ritual sacrifice in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. And this, of course, matches perfectly with these other similar witness claims of these ritual sacrifices carried out in Yonkers and Untermeyer. And so this involved prominent cult members, such as Brother John, who we were just discussing, who was an early member of the 22 Disciples of Hell. Now, Fuzz1 claims that he had met a child prostitute in Van Cortlandt Park. This is another thing that I didn't realize. This is so tragic and devastating and something you don't want to realize as being a reality, but there are child prostitutes. There are young children who are legitimately lured in by networks of pedophiles who essentially attempt to groom them by offering them. They'll even, at certain examples, they'll like the Massachusetts ring that I did a bit of research in as far as their connection to NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, and the Spotlight scandal. It's terrible, but it really does prove out the fact that, this is unfortunately being, this is a perfect window, an unexpected window, and an unfortunate one at that provides us with, right, the realistic framework of a very well-established pedophile underground that I never in my life wanted to acknowledge as being a reality. Right.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that, brother. And it gets so much darker than that.
Yeah. It seems like there's like different undergrounds, like, you know what I mean? Like underground rings, whether it's like a pedophile ring or like some kind of a cult ring. And they seem to overlap. Like they might not be the exact, all the same people, but they all have like this contact, like whether it's a supply thing, like, hey, we'll give you this for this or whatever. Like, it's like a big fucking, a circus of like horribleness, you know what I mean? That's going on.
True. No, I've been describing it recently as, and I even saw it described by perpetrators of the network that were basically explaining that this is an enterprise, this, and the usual suspects who are facilitating the enterprise. It's a smaller group of individuals than you would ever imagine. As far as the level of power that they wield, their ability to infiltrate trial proceedings. I mean, at every level, they can compromise a jury, they can compromise a prosecuting, attorney, a district attorney, a judge, whatever the case may be. This is how they conduct themselves. And the fact of the matter is, when you have, even in the terms of the Atlanta child murders, you have the Vice President, George Bush Sr., going down to Atlanta and hosting a meeting at the governor's mansion saying, if you don't cover this thing up, the feds are getting involved, all right? And as soon as the feds get involved, they're provided with the plausible patsy.
Yeah.
To take the fall for the wider network at play. And when you realize that this all fits a playbook that has been recycled over time, that Iran-Contra wasn't anything new, right? This is nothing new. You can go back to the cadaver connection with the Fort Bragg murders and show how Ike Atkinson was clearly helping facilitate a domestic drug trafficking operation through Fort Bragg and all the way from Miami to New York, man. And they're facilitating domestically. They're facilitating heroin, cocaine from the Golden Triangle specifically at the time, and the Philippines as well. And what are they utilizing? Not only are they compromising, let's say the local narcotics officers of, let's say, in Fort Bragg, for example, the Fayetteville, North Carolina Police Department, compromised, legitimately working hand in hand to facilitate the domestic drug trafficking operation in a covert manner, and utilizing criminal informants to their benefit in running these operations, hand in hand with the military police on base, who are helping facilitate the exact same covert operation, who are then burying any sort of individual with integrity and moral values who would attempt to blow the whistle in terms of a wider network being facilitated at the time to provide funds for black bag operations for the intelligence apparatus. Not only that's just one aspect of the layered operation being conducted that is pursuing, this strategic outcome. And so it doesn't, to them, to the operators, it's too compartmentalized.
Yeah.
They can go to sleep at night thinking, I'm not directly responsible for the death of all those children in Atlanta. Right? It's just like, I can't even imagine that mindset. But the outline of the enterprise, brother, we're talking targeted assassinations. You want to consider it's very interesting because the Son of Sam case specifically, if you look at who some of the actual victims were, it's fascinating stuff. And basically what you discover is that essentially you have this connection to basically what becomes essentially Nugan Bank, which were helping, obviously facilitate this massive what was a clandestine drug trafficking domestic operation at the time. And you had Nugan Bank directly involved in this. And when it boils down to the fact that you can clearly point out there are these overlapping threads to these medical supplies apparently being linked to how they were trafficking the heroin through. It's interesting because they used hospital and medical connections. And they used a hospital and another company in Hawaii as two places that got apparently that got these drugs ready to come to the U.S. in these shipments in these GI body bags. Yeah. And so basically what they were doing is that the cadaver connection was essentially utilizing dead GIs from Vietnam.
Yep.
And essentially it's a very sick thing, right? That was being conducted. And Ted Gunderson kind of, he did a great job initially describing the reality in terms of what was being conducted through Fort Bragg using these basically they would cut open the dead bodies of the GIs and they would shove in these plastic bags of actual heroin. Yeah. And then they would put a identifiable essentially they had like I forget the actual term of what they would place on the body bag and coffin that would then of course help distinguish which was actually, part of the operation and which wasn't. So the individuals who were at least scheduled to receive the product through the covert operation would know which one to even open up and things of that nature. It's very interesting, but anyway, it's something that when you realize that some of the individuals in the Son of Sam case were working for these hospital companies that were involved with with these basically these interesting using these medical tools and various obvious. It's just very fascinating to me that I think it was Moskowitz herself that was actually working for one of the local hospitals that were a part of this operation, but it's not at all surprising to me. So it's the way of the world at this point, buddy. You know what I mean? And anyway, there's also, if you consider the fact that you have Berkowitz, right? Who this is very interesting because clearly, not only were they basically David Berkowitz was providing drugs for some of the kids that were being provided to the parties at Roy Cohn's place in Connecticut and Greenwich Village, I think is where it was. And I'm not going
to say much, but look who Roy Cohn's good buddies with. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Mentor. Where's my Roy Cohn? Yeah. And you wonder why the Epstein documents haven't come out. It's like, man, I heard that the Epstein network was just Roy Cohn's network of human compromise passed on to a new asset. Yeah. Which pretty fascinating. Yeah. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if that were the case. Yeah. But
it's wild. Yeah, it's wild because all these things that you think all individually, these are all fucked up little operations that are going on or fucked up happenings. But when you can see that there's overlap with players in between them, it's like how wild does this all get? And it's how mind blown does it all get? And it's how, I don't want to say it's disheartening, but it's what's the end game of all this? Is it just money? You know what I mean? Is it just greed? Because it's, obviously, you have the enterprise, right? So there's people that are at some level where there's probably just about power and control. But then you get the bottom players that are doing the dirt, the horrible shit. And it's just, are they just psychopaths and they get off on this? Or do they believe in some of these ideologies of cults that they're involved in? It's wild, to go, you can go up and down the chain and it's just rotten the whole way. You know what I mean? But for different reasons, for different motives, different reasons, different, whatever, and then it's there's political power, there's money, there's greed, and then there's just, you get into the more wild stuff where there's just people that are total degenerates. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Yeah. But I'm beginning to think, man, because obviously black markets, they're consistently, there's a reason that drugs aren't legal, right? They're legitimately exploiting the fact that it's one of the most lucrative black market, as far as just one of the most lucrative black markets that exist in the world. And I think that it's effectively being propped up by this international cabal of intelligence agencies that seemingly there's no real distinction between them. I view the CIA and the Mossad and the MI5 as really one and the same. Yeah. It's one perverse network that leads into the other, and they consistently pursue the very same interests in more ways than one. And at the very least, provide reinforcement at levels that the other cannot. And it's another reason why I view the two-party paradigm as a delusion, right? Because it's one side accomplishes what the other cannot. Yeah. And this to me is sort of in no way a black pill, because obviously I think that there is hope within the idea of pursuing individual sovereignty at a personal level and understanding the way the world works. I think that in itself provides hope, because again, it's if you're capable of getting to that point and then re-engaging with reality with this newly embraced toolkit in place. You've provided yourself with, you've sort of manufactured the necessary defense mechanism to protect yourself and your family at least a level that, at the level you're capable of in the current structured system. Because again, it's like, once you kind of realize what we're discussing here, this is not, as far as the ability to solve this overnight, this you should be under no real, I think that is just a false framework. It's something that will lead you to a black pill, because you will lose all hope. You won't quite, I'm beginning to realize that quickly, obviously, I think it's the natural progression of this, just becoming more exposed to this information. You kind of realize that there are conversations worth having and conversations that aren't. And clearly, what are you actually accomplishing anything worthwhile? Are you in a place where perhaps these ideas would actually take root, or are you just wasting your time? Because I think that, or even worse, maybe you're even, because I'm speaking just from personal reference here, as far as like individuals I wish I could, that are very close to me, that I wish I could have an influence on, and I could sort of help, spur them in the proper direction in my own conceptual outline of reality itself. And I think often of the fact that I can't have much of an impact, but what I realize is that those aren't the conversations worth having. No, it's like you all you can do is live by example and attempt to, again, outline this conceptual, framework for yourself personally, because only then can you kind of like act upon these principles.
True. It's like you can't. It's like weird because like I think everyone goes through this, like when you first start learning about this stuff, you want everyone to know. And you're like, you're going out there, you're yelling it, you're like, dude, what, and you're like trying to talk to everybody. And 90% of people probably, if not more, aren't ready to hear this stuff. And then, any strand of what we talked about today is like fucked up and almost unbelievable to people. Like, cause you're like, no way. Like, why would that happen? And like, these people really wouldn't do that. No, it's true. Like, right. But the more research you do, the more you realize it's true. The more like, stuff you talked about today, there was stuff I didn't know about that. Like, I didn't realize there was all this overlapping in some of these areas. And then when you see that it overlaps and that there's like more of an organization behind things, then it just gets like really disheartening. But like you said, what you can do is, look out for you, look out for the people immediately around you. When you go outside, the sun's still shining. There's still a lot of good going on out there. Don't get, told, like you said, like I think it's like you coming out of doing all the research with the Atlanta child murders, like put you in a little dark place. You got to get back, you got to get back in the, there's still like go pet a kitten or something, right? You know what I mean? There's still cool, there's still cool shit going on. There's still like, but I do think, at the end of the day that there's like, I don't know if there's like, not to get weird with it, but like there's like spiritual balance in the world, right? And it seems like sometimes that it can be out of whack, like where like darkness is like heavier than what's going on, but there's still like a lot of good shit going on in the world. And I'm not trying to be woo woo about shit or whatever, but like, you got to do this for your own mental health. Like there's still like cool stuff. Like people are still like rad for the most part. Like, even though they might have us fighting amongst each other to keep us distracted from some other bullshit that's going on.
Right.
And it's like, stay connected with good people, do good shit, like try and do right by people, you know what I mean? Just basic stuff will keep you more grounded, than.
Oh man, there's hope in just the ability for us to have this conversation, obviously, because that alone, now clearly there's still a level of censorship that's being, conducted and utilized to of course, kind of memory hold much of this. And another reason why.
I bet this episode won't get as many views as like, like when I do one like about like some punk rock stuff or something, or like some motorcycle stuff.
That makes sense. But I will say there is a legitimate appetite as far as just for the truth itself. And the reality is that, unfortunately, and this is another reason why I think that so very often I find myself re-engaging with these threads of investigation that cover very similar aspects of these overlapping threads of these cases, that criminal cases that, again, they affect the most vulnerable among us.
Yeah.
And this plight of the vulnerable individual that clearly has no defense mechanism in place or caretakers to provide any sort of protection. I think I just, for the life of me, it's something that I have to prioritize and spotlight as often as possible, and attempt to find root causes and get to the bottom of the reality of some of these cases. Because the fact of the matter is, just as we mentioned earlier with Epstein and Dutroux, and these various examples of the Berkowitz, John Wayne Gacy. I think John Wayne Gacy, another example of being a part of the Odyssey Foundation with John David Norman. He basically was working with this individual named Phil Paskey, who Phil Paskey worked on his construction crew, while John David Norman had essentially been arrested, serving time in prison for running a massive child trafficking operation utilizing, snuff films and child pornography. And he had gone to prison. While he's in prison, basically restructured the exact same network that was the Odyssey Foundation, didn't restructure it, just renamed it and called it the Delta Project. And then he tasked Phil Paskey with running the Delta Project while he was imprisoned. And essentially, this was all while Phil Paskey was working on the construction crew of John Wayne Gacy. And they were clearly abducting children for the overall network at play here. So I don't believe John Wayne Gacy was the sole killer of all those children. I believe that he was a low-hanging fruit in a wider network. That, and by the way, you look at his connections with Ed Kemper and the JCs, this junior youth organization that was intended to recruit and acknowledge and identify these children or youths with characteristics that provided them to be potential political, have a path to politics, sort of, right, and be an influential, prominent member going forward, as far as in this sort of influential, obviously, framework. And the JCs, obviously Bill Clinton, so many different people are affiliated with this organization. And John Wayne Gacy himself was put in charge of this JC's organization in Waterloo, right? Which is just like fascinating that Ed Kemper was also a member of the JCs, and they directly knew each other based on this affiliation, and that John Wayne Gacy was in charge of creating basically this. They were having so Jimmy Carter's wife, Rosalind, was sent to Chicago. All right, on this apparently this good faith sort of like attempt to mend bridges for this sort of political apparent this sort of just political divide. There was a miscommunication, some sort of it was interesting, but she was sent there to sort of like attempt to kind of like ease the tension in terms of this political, formidable sort of. It's very interesting. But either way, John Wayne Gacy, he was obviously the one who created this basically a political event to welcome Rosalind Carter to Illinois, and was the individual there to receive her. And so when that actually happens, and then you discover the fact that he, of course, is, and by the way, Jeffrey Dahmer, I found out potentially he's a member of the Hand of Death. And so that makes a lot more sense as to why Detective James Rothstein, who effectively said that he was really targeted and prioritized by the CIA in an attempt to silence him. They first tried to recruit him because they said, wow, like you're really great at your job. You're former military intelligence. You were on the Essex, I believe, is the name of the, I can't remember now, the name of the military intelligence vessel that was sent to Cuba during the Bay of Pigs. And even the clandestine covert operatives who were on board of this military intelligence vessel had no idea of the actual destination. And when they left port, and they wound up off the coast of Cuba during the Bay of Pigs operation, where all these dead bodies are washing up. And you had members of, let's say, it's Frank Sturgis, right? He's one of the individuals who broke into the Watergate.
Yeah,
he was on the Essex, and he legitimately said that basically James Rothstein, he essentially he gained his trust, Frank Sturgis, during an interrogation, because he basically revealed the fact that he knew of the Essex. He was on board at the time, and so provided him with the reality that he was a member of military intelligence. And he said as much, Frank Sturgis. He said the only way you would know of this vessel is if you were affiliated with military intelligence and actually on it. And so then he became willing to talk with him. And this was all after Detective James Rothstein, who, as I mentioned before, investigated the Son of Sam case, traced the Process Church east, calling them the Interstate 90 and Interstate 9094, I think, murders, something to that effect. And it's very interesting, to say the least, that he was involved in this level of Watergate investigation, where he apparently arrests Frank Sturgis, who's on the way to Marita Lorenz's apartment. Marita Lorenz, right? She was apparently, her father was a Nazi SS U-boat captain, which reminds me of Operation Paperclip instantly, because this is so very often the narrative. And she basically became like a spook from day one. She was a child spook, essentially utilized in the covert operations, and was sent by the CIA to Cuba to seduce Fidel Castro and attempt to assassinate him. And as she goes to Cuba, she allegedly falls in love with him during the course of her alleged seduction, and winds up pregnant, and then wakes up no longer pregnant, with the baby nowhere to be found. And so she had been drugged and then brought back to the States and put in a CIA safe house, where she claimed that she then rubbed shoulders with E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, while they were planning the 1963 assassination of JFK.
Yeah.
And that she even went with them to transport weapons across state lines to Dallas before it all actually happened. She claimed to have files of this, and that is why Frank Sturgis was sent to assassinate her at her apartment. And so this was all tipped off to Detective Rothstein, who investigated the Son of Sam case and the Process Church, and claims that it's a major organization that is providing plausible deniability for the intelligence apparatus, who are clearly involved in not only abducting children and auctioning them off in major locations like Vegas, which even Ted Gunderson himself claimed was happening, who ran the FBI field office in LA. He says the Finders Cult was also a created organization to abduct and kidnap children as a cutout for the CIA to then auction them off for various purposes. And the Finders Cult, whenever their warehouse was raided and the W Street apartments, they found private computer nodes. And this is in 1987. Right? This is not a normal occurrence. Clearly, this isn't happening often at the time. It was state of the art. And they had private computer nodes that were communicating internationally, one of which was conducting communication with an asset at the Chinese embassy, where they were arranging a kidnapping of a Chinese child. And so essentially they were abducting Chinese children and having them sent internationally. And so that's another aspect of this. And I think they were on their way to Matamoros at the time, which was another location when they were stopped in Tallahassee in 1987, the two individuals that were perpetrators in the Finders case and were caught with those children in the park. They were on their way to Matamoros, Mexico, where, guess what? Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were being trained with the hand of death. And they were claiming that these cannibal ritualistic murders were being conducted, but also auctioning off of children who had been kidnapped in these various networks that were being facilitated through entities like the Odyssey Foundation, which John Wayne Gacy was affiliated with, and right.
Where did Dahmer come into this again? I know you said he might have connections to Hand of Death, but then we kind of got off. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good, brother. And I know it's like we could talk about this. Yeah,
this is wild. I didn't know about this Dahmer stuff. That's why I was like, what?
So it turns out this is very crazy. But not at all surprising in the context of what we kind of discuss so very often, right? But check this out. So you have, remember, John Paul Ranieri, who is Brother John, who is a direct in as far as directly affiliated with the Process Church, and basically he really provides this interesting connection to the mafia, organized crime syndicates, being sort of, it's the intersection, right, where intelligence meets organized crime and bridges the gap to these occult organizations and these clandestine operations being conducted. But so you have essentially Ranieri moving to the Midwest and starting his own street ministry in Milwaukee. And he ends up, now this is after he said he met J. Edgar Hoover at private parties at the Plaza Hotel, and that Hoover's name was never mentioned. But Hoover was always in drag, and Ranieri said he could tell that the FBI director was sure that no one recognized him. And he also said that he had ensured his own survival by having in his possession a photograph of himself with Hoover. So this is what John Paul Ranieri says helped keep him safe and protect him, was this sexual blackmail he had on J. Edgar Hoover. So Brother John Paul Ranieri, he claims that, of course, he moves to Milwaukee after this and ended up also, apparently, after starting the street ministry in Milwaukee, he goes to Rome in 1983, and he meets with Pope John Paul II. Now, this is interesting as well, because Pat Sullivan brought Pope John Paul II to Denver in 1993, who then became acquainted with Jeffrey Dahmer, himself a notable member of the Process Hand of Death cult dating back to his time in Miami, which directly ties in Parnell Traham, which ties in the Atlanta child murders, because Parnell Traham was from Miami, running the drug trafficking operation, who hated children and was abducting them on behalf of the local organization of the Process Church and Wild Billy Donovan Parker, or whatever his name was, in Atlanta at the time, who's effectively affiliated with this uprooted Process chapter that had just fled New York, upstate New York, after the David Berkowitz killings and the Son of Sam. This is crazy, right? Like, in no way did I ever think all of these connected.
Yeah. No, this gets a wild drop right there.
Right? Yeah. It's fascinating, man. But this is the remember I had mentioned the Nugan Bank, heroin importation, likely connected to the CIA drug trafficking at the time, the cadaver connection out of the Golden Triangle, smuggled in through blood supplies and laundered profits through the Nugan Bank, seemingly provided a link to this individual named Philip Arthur Thompson, who owned a medical supply business. Now, this also ties in Ike Atkinson and the cadaver connection, which is the Jeffrey McDonald Fort Bragg murders case. And that's what happened. 2 heroin overdoses, or I believe 1 heroin overdose and 2 heroin addicts brought in an individual who had overdosed. And if you realize that once this trafficking operation was greenlit, you had such a staggering rise in statistical deaths of opiate overdose and heroin overdose, especially surrounding local communities that are surrounding these military bases, specifically Fort Bragg as well, right? Which you had just a ludicrous, extraordinary categorical rise in heroin overdoses at this time. So then you have Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, who works on base, described as a golden boy. He's then moonlighting at a local hospital, about like an hour away or something of that effect. And he then, apparently, he had a policy where he told his nurses, due to the fact that we're having these overwhelming, statistical overdoses of heroin, we need to refer these cases to the local authorities. So he's tipping off the local PD at least his nurses are, anytime one of these individual overdose cases comes in through his specific medical practice, that he's obviously moonlighting at a local hospital. And so that is exactly what apparently took place. Now, this apparently led to the arrest potentially of Ike Atkinson, who was running the Cadaver Connection through Fort Bragg for as, by the way, a member of the local Process Church chapter, who was affiliated through the Helena Stokely witnesses as conducting a fertility death ritual on the night of the Fort Bragg murders, when Jeffrey McDonald's 3.5-year-old daughter, 5-year-old as well, and his pregnant wife were all murdered. And yeah, Helena Stokely was one of the 4, I believe, perpetrators who were in his home that night, wearing ceremonial gowns, right? Meaning ritualistic robes, carrying candles, named by all the Helena Stokely witnesses, the nearby neighbors who were witnesses as well, claiming they witnessed the fact that there were individuals wearing these robes and holding candles that were on their way to Jeffrey McDonald's residence, who then went in and said, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," as they were chanting when they assaulted him. One of the individuals being an African-American in military garb with, I forget what his rank was on his patch, but this was Ike Atkinson, allegedly. And he was affiliated with running the heroin operation, domestically facilitating it throughout the U.S. as a local member of the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Isn't that fascinating stuff, man? I mean, I'm not at all surprised, but once you get into it, you begin to realize, as deep as this organization tends to, like, again, it's like you only come across, you stumble across their connections.
Yeah.
At the deeper level and layer of investigation with many of these cases. But once you do, it provides this sort of framework of honestly, it's just almost, it's hard to conceptualize as far as the widespread effect that this network seems to have. And, but also,
yeah, it's like almost like you need to chart it. Like, you know what I mean? Like we
need a map.
A map. Yeah. Like it's just like, with a line showing all the connections to everything. That's
right.
It's like, it's like drug operations, child trafficking operations, just ritual cult killings, like serial killers, like, and then to think the process ended up as like what's it called? The Friends, and they just do the best friends adoption.
Refuge.
Yeah.
Like, could you imagine?
Yeah.
And the depth of just the kind of sinister connections that all tie back into Utah, Idaho, and San Francisco are very notable. It's very interesting because they seem to be sort of hubs of MK Ultra at the time. Yeah. And I saw it described as that as well, because
even apparently New York too, with Montauk, and that was exactly. An MK Ultra site.
Oh, dude. David Berkowitz, he's directly connected into with Montauk as well, and the golf club there. And I didn't realize that this it spans the domestic U.S. all the way to Newport Beach, where you have the Magic Island Club, and I had mentioned William Mincer earlier, the infamous Manson too, who he not only was a hitman who murdered Roy Radin, but he 100% was affiliated as a member of the Magic Island Club in Newport Beach, California, and was, as I mentioned, the trusted bodyguard for Larry Flint, right, founder of Hustler magazine.
Yeah.
Well, he legitimately is connected to this Newport Beach club that apparently, is a private social club in L.A. that was formed specifically to cater to these mystical interests, it says. They claim that this included drug trafficking, sadomasochistic sex, and also apparently the club had a branch in Houston, which perfectly ties in Dean Corll and the murders that took place in Houston, which apparently Dean Corll and his connections to those child murders directly lead back to John Wayne Gacy and the Odyssey Foundation and John David Norman, which were all being, and also, if you consider the fact that you had Michael Thevis, who is involved in Atlanta at the time, and that he apparently was also a producer. So he was a child pornography kingpin at the time. And apparently the Gemini group that Wayne Williams, who's the alleged perpetrator of the Atlanta child murders, the Gemini group, which he utilized to effectively recruit children under the guise of claiming that he's a talent spotter for the music industry, and that he's going to actually set them on the path to stardom, and that he was acknowledging and identifying these characteristics within these children, that they had some sort of penchant for celebrity, and then he would take them to the local production studios owned by Michael Thevis, the pornography kingpin, and they would then conduct child pornography, or they would have snuff films that were filmed and produced through there, which all tied back as well. The Finders cult were ordering children from the Odyssey Foundation, which had an actual publication that was affiliated in the pedophile underground, that was legitimately, it was advertising for the Delta Project at the time. And so again, this is another thing that I was unaware of, is that clearly you have these, it's such a well-established network that you have legitimate publications that are being circulated underground for this strange clandestine pedophile underworld, that are really just advertising to these sadistic individuals, attempting to provide them with an avenue to achieve their most sinister sexual proclivities. I mean, that's truly what was playing out. And the fact of the matter is, all of this connects, man. You cannot have John Wayne Gacy without John David Norman. You cannot have Dean Corll and Wayne Williams without this vast, well-established underground network of child abuse.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, if Ted Gunderson's right, and the Finders cult was a cutout for the CIA for plausible deniability, to auction off children and abduct them, utilizing child care organizations and babysitting services, they had instructions that they were distributing through the network on how exactly you could go about moving the children through different jurisdictions so they wouldn't be found in your possession. Imagine this, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, it's something that you cannot stomach. And this is why I think that I'm like obsessively pursuing this information in a way that is like probably very unhealthy to me personally, because it's just not something that, it's not something you want to come to terms with, man. You know what I mean?
No, like, and even if a 1/10 of what you're finding is actual reality, and I'm not saying it's only a 1/10, but even if it was 100th, it's fucking horrible. Yeah. Never mind if it was like 50% reality, or 100, you know what I mean? Like, that's the problem with all this stuff. Like, and it's like, again, what is planned? What is just coincidence? What is just, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it doesn't matter. It's all the stuff's happening. You know what I mean? Whether it's connected or not, and it's just. And
I think it's hard to deny the fact that there's a natural inclination for sociopathic maniacs to pursue powerful positions to insulate themselves from accountability.
Yeah.
And I think that is natural. That is the natural order of things. And for people to be naive to that concept, it only puts you in a position where you're in danger, where you're running a risk, man. Of extraordinary, it's like a risk you should not be willing to run, as much as it disturbs you to your core. And you have to reflect again on what is potentially reality, what is possible, how do you even view the power paradigm as it currently exists? You have to ask all those questions, because we've been fed nothing but a web of lies that has diabolically disrupted our ability to effectively interpret reality.
Yeah.
And at that point, what do we even do?
And then there's so many layers to it. It's hard to even figure out what the end game is. You know what I mean? Because like the end game is different depending on the layer you're at. But then there's a couple of, like you said, as you alluded to earlier, there's a small group that's at the top of that, the top layer, the top echelon, and it's all filtering up, it's all kicking up, and it's just like, what is the end game? Like, what does this all boil down to? Like, and if all of this, if there's a structure behind all this, what is the point of it? Like, because it's like you could understand it if it's like drug running, right? And it's like, okay, we want to keep drugs illegal because we're making a lot of money off these drugs.
Right.
And it's like, that level of crime has, accountability to it. It has victimhood to it, but it's not the same thing as abducting and running children or killing children on film to distribute these films for profit. Like, there's different levels of like horribleness, like, you know what I mean, and social depravity, and psychopathic, like the level of like psychopathic, also ability that you have to have to it. Like George Carlin, like there's always like when it was simpler, like George Carlin, like when you talk about power and stuff, he's like, he had a thing where it's like, oh, it's a game that, this is like a big game that, there's a big club that you're not part of.
Right.
But what really is, it's a big club that you don't want to be fucking part of. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like why would you want to be involved in any of this? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
man, and I've said for quite some time now, I honestly believe at this moment that for far too long in DC, the ultimate currency has been sexual blackmail and human compromise.
Yeah.
Right. And if you only consider in an honest way, and this is not at all just like, it's just attempting to engage with reality in a way that is unfortunately here's the honest impression that I have at this moment is that all you have to realize is if you're a sociopath, right, and you're willing to obviously exploit the aspect of or just the clandestine ability to traffic drugs domestically or anywhere internationally. The obvious next step, and this is if you're a sociopath with no moral inclination, no ethical values whatsoever, now you will clearly compartmentalize this operation as much as you possibly can, and unless you truly enjoy it. But still, you don't even have to really embody what it is to be a sociopath at a certain level to realize that the next obvious step is to exploit human compromise and traffic individual human beings, right? Because what will be more lucrative than trafficking drugs and trafficking, let's say, even pornography? It's the actual individual themselves would run far more of a profit if you're considering the enterprise itself at that level.
Sure.
And not at all am I saying that
like
you as a moral individual.
Yeah, because there's a big difference. Like you said, like the true sociopath that's going to excel at this, like there's a difference between the guy that's selling drugs on the street because he needs money to survive. He ain't like trying to kill nobody or traffic nobody. That's like a different level of that game, like who might be associated with it because of like where they're getting their product from, but they're not associated with that whole network of like the true sociopath that's like running it and exploiting it, like so. Right. But at the game, like where you're child trafficking, there's nobody that's not a sociopath associated with that. Like that's a different level of degeneracy.
And that's another reason why, like. I'm not at all attempting to defend Wayne Williams when I bring up the Atlanta child murders, calling him a patsy for a wider network. I believe he was low-hanging fruit, just as Jeffrey Epstein and Mark Dutroux, who was responsible for procuring children for the network. Yeah. Right? Now, I don't necessarily know if he was at all responsible for even any of the deaths at this moment. It's very much in question. But that doesn't mean that he's right, that he's obviously justified in any of his actions being affiliated with this net. No, not not whatsoever. And so it's just something that is difficult to deal with because you're dealing with all of these various layers of affiliation to the network itself.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, obviously you have levels of incrimination, but at the same time,
it's even like Berkowitz, like he said he didn't do them all. And he said there was a network and it was like,
I was involved in 3 and I only pulled and I didn't even pull the trigger on those. He said, I believe it, or
he pulled the trigger
might
on
have
like
pulled
one
the
or
trigger
two
on
or so.
2.
Yeah.
I think if I remember. And yeah, but it's fascinating because he 100% claims that he was clearly there with other individuals who he says was in a van.
He's smart enough not to say who they are, you know what I mean? But like he's smart enough not to.
And by the way, they tried to slit his throat whenever he first came out, saying that, at least mentioning the fact that he was a part of a network.
Yeah.
Claiming he was unwilling to mention any names due to, obviously his personal welfare and the welfare of his own personal family, specifically his father, I think. But
yeah, which shows that he's not that crazy. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? He's not that psychopath.
You know who else said that? Helena Stokely, the criminal informant witness for the narcotics detective Prince Beasley in the Fort Bragg murders for Jeffrey McDonald. She came out and she claimed all of this, and she said, I cannot name the names of the individual perpetrators involved in this network, right?
Yeah.
But clearly, she said it was due to the welfare of her unborn child, which, Helena Stokely was found dead, right? Very soon after the fact that she made all these statements to Ted Gunderson and Prince Beasley on the record. And I'm not at all surprised because she said as much, that she had been called and threatened by members of the process that were telling her that her unborn child was going to be prioritized in a ritualistic murder if she didn't shut her mouth. And when you have the audacity to be affiliated and a member, and she was initiated that night in the murders of Jeffrey McDonald's family. That was allegedly what happened. Helena Stokely was initiated in that fertility death ritual, and she was the one holding one of the candles that was foreign to the location of Jeffrey McDonald's home, as far as the candle wax that was discovered at the crime scene, where she was chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," and even answered a phone call during the alleged assault and then of course the murders, but the alleged assault of Jeffrey McDonald. She answered the phone, and even like hysterically laughed when someone was attempting to. It was just very interesting. But it's never, as I mentioned before, we reside in the gray zone. There never seems to be one single motivating factor to many of these operations. They seem to be layered in the objectives that they're intended to achieve. And I think that is what is difficult for many people to just kind of understand. Well, at least come to grips with, because
it's layered and compartmentalized, you know what I mean? So that it doesn't, what overlaps and what doesn't is, and the motives, like you said, it doesn't really, it's not apparent, it's
exactly,
it's so different. Yeah. At the end of the day, though, it's wild, man. And it's like, I don't know. My head's like, I'm tired now, man, mentally exhausted. Like, and it's, like you said, it's tough stuff. It's heavy stuff. And dude, I thank you for, like, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know about a lot of these connections. Like, I was familiar with a lot of these cases, but not the, the next level up of connection between a lot of this stuff. It's wild.
I think I've, I started out kind of doing like a little bit of a staged introduction to some of these cases, which didn't provide that deeper layer of criminality that seems to be legitimately corroborated over time. And, I think that's the reason why that my Pizzagate episode was pulled directly off of YouTube instantly, because it implicates an active network of child trafficking in Washington, D.C. at this very moment.
Yeah.
And I think that when you realize the fact that, man, I just discovered, now I knew the Laura Silsby story, right? Procuring children from Haiti, being caught at the Haitian border with these abducted children, being imprisoned, and then being freed by Bill Clinton, who flies to Haiti and effectively removes you from, and then, by the way, brings you back to the domestic U.S., places you on the Amber Alert system. So I then discover the fact that apparently there's even more of a connection. And this is crazy. So you remember Amy Coney Barrett, right? Who was that individual woman who seemed to be paraded around in that moment of Brett Kavanaugh's appointment and on the Supreme Court, I believe. And it was supposed to be this, this damning evidence of the sexual improprieties of the political class on the right. And he perfectly embodied that in the Amy Coney Barrett, or Coney Barrett. Her name's terrible, but clearly she was a manufactured asset in this. It's very interesting because you always can kind of just follow these threads of evidence into these very much these reoccurring areas of interest that consistently resurface over time. And it turns out that Amy Coney Barrett, who was politically used and utilized as a tool for, in my mind, kind of smoke and mirrors, right? To further escalate the culture war in many ways and not actually deal with any sort of realistic, concept and root cause that will provide you with a window into the current fabric of reality itself. And that is where you have Amy Coney Barrett and her husband adopting 2 children from Haiti. Mm. And one of Amy Coney Barrett's children was reportedly adopted from NLCR, which is the New Life Children's Refuge founded by Laura Silsby. Yeah. It's like, I don't know. Like, is that coincidence? Because that's very difficult to imagine as being, an isolated example of just mere coincidence of one of these political operatives being utilized against us in the culture war. But I could be wrong. Yeah. Who knows?
Well, if all the listeners who've made it this far, I want to thank you. It's a lot to digest. It's a lot to think about. You're probably going to be sad and down for a little bit. Just, if you're not a total sociopath, if you are a sociopath, you're looking up how to join the local process church. Oh God, no, I think if I've looked into the because there was for a while they were in Massachusetts as well, in Cambridge, and they left there, but
who incorporated the process in Massachusetts was that same individual. So John Markham, who was on the defense team. So first of all, he incorporated the process in Massachusetts, or was a member of the process in Massachusetts, then went to San Francisco and incorporated the chapter in San Francisco, which of course was affiliated with Manson when he's brushing shoulders with the process organization while living on Cole Street near Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. And it's interesting because, right, like John Markham, he's connected directly back to Satanic Murder, Inc. He's not only a member of the process in Massachusetts, who was a part of the Magical Child bookshop in upstate New York and helped run that same bookstore where David Berkowitz was implicated in as far as claiming he was recruited in by the Carr family. Well, it turns out, man, it is fascinating stuff because John Markham, he inevitably winds up on the defense team of one Jeffrey McDonald from the Fort Bragg murders. Yeah, man. Yeah. Like, isn't that amazing? And John Markham, by the way, not only was he affiliated with Jeffrey McDonald's defense team, but so was another individual attorney who was found in Philadelphia, I believe it was, executed on the spot in his car. All right. Turns out he was directly affiliated with the local drug trafficking operation being conducted. And so that's why he was executed. And he was also on the defense team of one Dr. Jeffrey McDonald. So I'm very much under the impression that was doomed to fail from the beginning. And right, as far as the trial of Jeffrey McDonald. And you look at who was another one of his defense attorneys. It was Alan Dershowitz. So never ends, brother. It never ends.
Well, I mean, Yeah, we could go on forever, man, but I think we gave people a lot to digest tonight. I want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find you and find out more about the podcasts that you're doing? Because I know you have yours, and I know you do a few others, right? Like you're doing one with you do the one with Jose, then you do the one with aren't you doing one with Jesus Christ, Sam Tripoli? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so I have, obviously, the Underclass Podcast is my personal, as far as just my personal product that I began, and kind of is the umbrella for much of what I do, and even some of the interviews I do, I'll publish under the Underclass, just as far as the RSS. But yeah, I have another show on every Tuesday night, 9:30 p.m. Eastern time, right, with Jose Galison, and from Tower Gang Jose, from Tower Gang. His handle on Twitter is @TowerGangJose if you want to follow him. But he's great. He does the No Way Jose podcast. One of my favorite people in the world, just as far as having a conversation with, and very like-minded. We seemingly are at least very many of the same subjects appeal to us in many ways. And again, it's like anyone who's willing to have one of these conversations and in an objective way and attempt to, and I know I jumped around very much today. I apologize. I'm a little bit, this is why we call our audience schizo bros, because basically we have a schizophrenic mentality, and we seem to jump all over the place, but it's not, we don't do it for no reason. There's seemingly a very direct connection in many of these cases that as I've mentioned many times in this episode, that directly overlaps with each other, where you have these usual suspects that seemingly resurface in these various cases.
Well, it's crazy because
relationships.
Each one of these cases is, the reason why it's so schizo is because each one of these cases is so wild on its own.
Yeah.
And then when you stop popping and making all the connections, well, this guy was here and he's also here and he's also here. It's like, you can't help but be like, it's not even schizo. It's just more like, advanced, ADD. You know what I mean? It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, like superior hyperactivity, because it's just like bananas, like how fast, and it just pops. It's like pop, 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 pop. Jesus Christ, this dude's here. He's here. He's here. He's, you know what I mean? And it's like, and and then there's all these organizations that all these different people are part of that are all connected, and it's all the most depraved stuff that is just like, the fuck is going on out there, man? You know what I mean? Like,
I'm telling you, buddy.
I wish I could do this stuff without using so many so many curse words, so that I could market it clean, but I can't. You know what I mean? Because it's like,
right. It's nearly impossible, brother, and it's hard because, again, when you kind of see the fact of the matter is, like, you have connections to, I continue to kind of just reference the Atlanta child case, but it's unfortunate because even Wayne Williams, who's the alleged perpetrator responsible for all these, even though he was only prosecuted and actually convicted for 2 murders of 2 adults, he's been pinned with over 24 murders, right? Just alluded to by the authorities, who closed, I believe, 22 cases after his conviction, without actually convicting him of any of these crimes. And he personally said, and there's a crazy interview of him on CNN, which I'll provide in my upcoming episode, which basically has Wayne Williams being confronted, who's still obviously serving a prison sentence over 40 years later. And he's confronted because in 1992, I believe, he wrote a biography. And he basically claimed that he was trained by Mitch Warbell in a CIA domestic black site outside of Atlanta, in these CIA training techniques, right? These advanced training techniques on essentially how to. By the way, he's involved with Jack Ruby as well. If you look into Mitch Warbell, he's involved in so many different scandalous, cases throughout recent modern history. And so again, it's fascinating stuff. And a reason why is that he claims he was 17 years old, recruited to this CIA domestic black site, and then trained in these various techniques in this clandestine operation. And when you connect that in with David Berkowitz and his direct connection to the Son of Sam and the Atlanta child murders and these programmed patsies, it's very strange. Because again, this is Atlanta child murders witness Shirley McGill, and I'll leave it at this. But she identified a picture of a man to whom she referred to as the White Bill, who I mentioned earlier, who is one of the leaders of the cult group in Atlanta. The photograph was of Billy Dan Parker, who is an Army veteran, construction worker from Texas, and a known associate of David Berkowitz. Now, he was in fact the individual who bought the one or more 44 caliber revolvers for Berkowitz in Texas. McGill's boyfriend, Parnell Traham, who happened to also be a Vietnam vet and drug kingpin, was also near the home of Jimmy Payne, one of the two adults who was allegedly murdered by Wayne Williams. He was convicted of, right? Mm-hmm. And according to these files from the field investigation conducted in Atlanta, Parnell Traham, he owned a vehicle which was placed outside of this very residence of the Payne's home, right, which allegedly abducted him. And even the mother of Jimmy Payne claimed that she recognized this individual, Parnell Traham, who had been in the area in her neighborhood just before leading up to the abduction of her son, who then went missing and was found murdered. So this undoubtedly connects Traham to the Payne murder, which connects him to Wayne Williams, obviously, who we now know was directly connected in with David Berkowitz. and so it's like, man, I don't know. Like, what do you even do with this information?
Yeah.
Because it really does kind of chart a course through unprecedented waters, man.
It does.
You know, and anyway, I was actually providing my plugs, and I think that what I intended to say was that, I have a show with Sam Tripoli called Whatever This Is, and Brad Binkley. It's so much fun that we do that typically either Monday nights or Tuesday nights most of the time. So we might still do it tonight.
Cool.
And we just kind of, you know, whatever this is, we discuss all the various doom scrolling, as far as like his show Doom Scrolling, so perfect because it perfectly embodies just this unfortunate oversaturated landscape of this, what seems to be this very much in my mind, a manufactured process of demoralization.
Yes.
Which is just kind of, again, just, I don't think we're intended to engage with as much of this negative information as obviously crosses, it's just, I don't think the human psyche is capable of putting it in its proper place, and
yeah, I would gather to say that the human psyche isn't made, I don't think, to deal with just this much information.
Yeah.
But, at all. And then so much of it being negative or stressful is just, horrible. That's why, I'm sure you got it too. Like every now and then you got to just take a break from it and just step away and go outside. Like I said, go pet a dog or something, man. You know what I mean? Because, think of the thousands of years people didn't leave like their village. Never mind, deal with this onslaught of like 24-hour massive, but even in like the 70s and 80s or whatever, we had like 3 channels, like, in the newspaper, you know what I mean? And it was like, that's what you dealt with. Like, and now it's just like every minute there's something, new. And it's just like, ba-pow, ba-pow, ba-pow. But the beauty of it is like, now there's so much information that you can research and put all these people together that no one would ever think are connected. You know what I mean? But, I don't know. There's pros and cons, and there's like, wins and costs to everything, man. You know what I mean? And it's like I said, just, everyone out there, just, keep everything in perspective, man. You know what I mean? Because
it's a spiritual battle.
It is. And it is like, it's like, I'm not even like a super religious person, but I can see that. Like I've been seeing that. I've been, more aware of that, especially over the last few years, that That's what it comes down to. You know what I mean? Like,
Agreed, man.
Get yourself right. You know what I mean? Because
telling you,
the world,
you have to surround yourself with, this is what I view as, I'm very grateful at this moment because I think that I've done a decent job at attempting to surround myself with people who are pursuing something worthwhile.
Yeah.
But also not imprisoned by this unfortunate, manipulative framework that has been very much designed to again, it's the point being, they want to corral you into re-engaging and embracing the establishment narrative at all times. And I think in every way we have to reject it, because I think this is where, right, we find ourselves at the intersection where we have to finally grapple with the reality of we're sort of being ruled by this strange group of like, the way that I kind of referred to it was during the Psychopath Machine, right?
Yeah.
When I referenced, the fact of the matter is, we seemingly are surrounded by psychopaths, and madness is everywhere. And I think that is by design. And I think the individuals, like John Ronson wrote in his book, right? And I think that the individuals who are very much affiliated with this control mechanism, it's, as I mentioned earlier, they're clearly, unfortunately, you have this weird sadistic inclination where, of course, you're going to have this unnatural rise to power with these individuals who are very much willing to compromise, right, their moral framework. And that is why the current, as far as the currency in DC at this very moment, is sexual blackmail and human compromise for how very long.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of the, you don't break into that class of influence and unless you, in some sort of extremely effective way, you've been compromised at that level. Yeah. And so that's why I at this point,
or I think even if you do happen to break through and have the best intentions, you very quickly, are talked to in some way or told, like, this is really how it goes. And if you want to go against that, then, I know you have a kid that you really love that, might have an accident tomorrow, you know what I mean? Or whatever it is. Like, because even if you're not involved in it, you fall under that control.
Absolutely. And you don't even have to really go to that extent in some of these human compromise networks, because if you consider like the Kinkora scandal and the Kinkora boys home, it's fascinating. They had basically a strategy called the elevator trick, and they would deploy these child prostitutes from the local Kinkora boys home, where they had essentially groomed them to be these, tools within the context of human compromise, right? I'm talking even using sophisticated methods of trauma-based mind control, would then deploy them to this local hotel, right, that specifically would house all the diplomats that would come into the area of Belfast at the time. And they had at least a couple of floors in the hotel that were rigged with audiovisual blackmail. And basically, they would provide a child prostitute, put them on the floor that the individual was staying on. And whenever the individual went into the elevator, the child prostitute would be waiting to then enter the elevator with the individual Mark, who was the priority, who then would be seen by the blackmail photographer in the lobby, exiting the elevator, brushing shoulders with a known child prostitute.
Yeah.
Right. And so they would capture the picture. They would now have sexual blackmail utilizing the elevator trick.
Yeah.
With an individual who wasn't a perpetrator of anything whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Imagine that. Yeah, I mean, that's even worse, because you're considering now you're compromised for nothing.
For nothing. Yeah. Yeah. It's It's a wacky world, man. It's a horrible situation, man. But I think you got to have some kind of sociopathic inclinations to even want power at this point, because you know what I mean. I mean, beyond local stuff, you know what I mean? Like, at national level type stuff,
and even then,
federal.
I reject the idea of controlling the ideology of my neighbor. It is just it's like they're attempting to groom the little totalitarian tyrant within us that truly is just kind of like, I think it's a desperate attempt to control our environment, because we're so very obviously we've been put into this position unbeknownst to us. And so in this desperate attempt, many people flock to the idea that, the prospect of controlling the ideology of your neighbor should somehow, take priority in the idea of discovering this alleged utopia. When in more ways than one, I think we need to just remind ourselves that in no way do we have a right to choose the lifestyle, right? Of now, of course, I think there's a level of depravity that clearly you're essentially, reaching the level of criminality, which obviously there's no longer a justification for your lifestyle, right? This is the point that I'm attempting to make. But clearly, I mean, in the context of morality itself and pursuing an ideology that is in no way kind of targeting individuals and
as long as you're not harming anybody,
exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm very, I guess, whatever you'd call it, libertarian in that way. You know what I mean? Like, just, as long as you're not harming me or anybody like that I know or love, or children or innocent people that can't protect themselves, then do whatever you want. Like, I don't care. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Do what you want, believe what you want. I don't care. It's not that I don't care. It's like, it doesn't affect me. You know what I mean? So it's like, do what you want. Like, that's why I hate all these people that, I don't hate these people, but I hate when people are like trying to control or ban speech, like that's hate speech. And it's like, no, it's stupid speech, but they got a right to think it and say it, as long as you're not harming anybody or inflicting bodily harm or doing something to you. People have a right to think whatever dumb shit they want. You know what I mean? And because once you start the road of censorship, it doesn't stop. And it's you don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. But guess what? Maybe have a better argument but don't try and censor these people. You're censoring, but that's, like you said, the programming that's going on is having people fall on that route. Like, the government needs to make these decisions for us or protect us from this or protect us from that. Like, no, it's not. That's not the role. Like, you know what I mean? That's
exactly what I think it's. And I'm even seeing it play out, obviously, within the framework of COVID, right? Which to me was kind of, it really set this dystopian agenda on fast forward in a way.
And because it got people to be compliant with having any dissension banned. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
To the point where they were banning legitimate doctors who worked on some of this research, who had dissenting opinions, and those people were shut down and marginalized. And you know what I mean? It's like, no,
exactly.
But then at the same time, they're saying follow the science. It's like, you can't follow the science if you're you know what I mean? If you're shutting people down.
And you cherry pick the data to only provide a false narrative in terms of the pharmaceutical company that you're clearly shilling for, which the vast majority of the mainstream media is bought and paid for by big pharma.
Well, and it's not even that they're bought and paid for; they're owned by the same conglomerates.
Brought to you by Pfizer. Now you wonder how the segment is not at all critical of the Pfizer vaccine. It's like, are you out of your mind? But in no way should that be difficult to understand. And what's hilarious to me.
But even if you just kick that up a notch, you look at who the major shareholders of Pfizer are, then you look at who the major shareholders of like MSNBC or Fox or CNN. Right. It's the same people own both. So, it's the same master that they're all answering to, It's like
exactly, man. Yeah. And you wonder, it's very interesting though, because you see the left wing, liberal progressives very much buying this hook, line, and sinker in many ways. And it's hilarious because if you truly believe this about these alleged corporations that you disdain, you hold so much disdain for, how can you not, obviously, conceptualize the reality that big pharma fits that bill to a T. And also,
it's like, how many lawsuits does Pfizer have to have for wrongful death or like withholding things like that? That's what I didn't get, man. Like I grew up, like we've talked a little bit about music stuff offline, but I grew up in the punk rock and hip hop worlds that were always like critical of big corporations. But then all these kids fell in line, or all these guys and girls, like adults, fell in line with the narrative. And it's like, no, you got to blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, bro, like, have you not looked at how corrupt Pfizer is as an organization? Like how many wrongful...
Rage on behalf of the machine, right? Isn't that what it was?
Yeah. Rage on behalf of the machine. Yeah.
Which is just hilarious. But it is a perfect example of, it's really this hypocrisy, that's at an extraordinary level. Yeah. And I think that it's been sewed into the framework of the conscious mind of the average individual, as far as just, if you can't realize and at the very least provide some sort of real distinction in terms of what you view as propaganda that is clearly sent to distract us and provide us with a false framework to engage with reality. And now you are taking a vaccine or an mRNA injection.
Yeah. It's
not now even for the flu, for the common flu, you're taking an mRNA injection for the common flu, and this is now your 8th booster or whatever that you're supposed to be on, and this is the legitimate as far as protocol. And it's very interesting when you see kind of how the media is leveraged to present this to the public, because all they do is demonize the as far as like they demonize the narrative that clearly is attempting to just question this, as far as like the data, as far as the precautionary measures in place for the safety trials of these vaccines, and how they've not been conducted since the very moment that Operation Warp Speed was greenlit. And that obviously now we don't even know what these boosters are, if they are any different than the original vaccine dose, or if they're not, if they're anything new for this alleged variant, which obviously I don't believe in any of this, but it's just hilarious to see it presented. Yeah. And again, what do? They sort of prioritize the individual who seems to be attempting to, let's say, reframe this as well until we have legitimate data that we can rely upon, right? With a real test as far as like a real isolated group of test subjects, right? Then clearly we shouldn't be administering this and as far as just recommending this to pregnant women and children. I mean, obviously, and old people, obviously, right? Yeah. Who,
especially when children weren't even like at any real risk other than just having a cold with it, like having being sick from it. Like they were at no like mortal risk, It was wild, dude. It's wild, man. But the fact is, even now that most of what we were saying back then has been actually, accepted and shown as being true and touted, by these organizations like CDC's, like, well, yeah, the masks don't work and social distancing doesn't work and blah, blah, blah. People are still doing it, because the brainwashing is so deep from the heavy propaganda that, like people that are only paying part attention are still like thinking they got to do this stuff. It's freaking wild, man. And it's sad.
Affected members of my own family, man. And I see them constantly sick. Like, I don't know what's happening to them. I feel as if potentially their immune system is entirely compromised and they have yet to come to terms with this. But I just, all I hear is that they are experiencing one of the worst sicknesses in their lives. And I haven't been this sick in forever. And that is each and every time. It's consistently the next time they are sick. It's
worse.
It's worse than it ever has been. And it's all these symptoms that are very uniquely different.
Yeah.
And to me, I haven't been sick in forever. Like, I don't know. I'm not at all, trying to act as if my immune system is superior, but I will say that it does make me question, why on earth? Obviously, all I'm attempting to do is remain healthy, work out, take a vitamin C supplement and some zinc and B3 or D3 or whatever the hell I'm doing, but very minimal in as far as I just want to essentially take a supplement that will help my overall immune system remain effective.
Yeah.
And I don't get sick, right? It's just crazy to see the difference.
Yeah.
And each and every one of these individuals I'm referencing all gladly volunteered to take the COVID vaccine. And so say what you want, but that alone means something to me. And I don't, how many other people are experiencing this in real time?
Yeah.
Where we don't even have to really talk about.
Yeah, it's not even sickness. It's things like myocarditis and like crazy heart issues and whatever.
Exactly. We don't even have to consider that if we're referencing what I just mentioned, because it's like that is actually seemingly being proven, right? That you're not having any cases of myocarditis that haven't taken the vaccine.
Yeah. It's crazy.
That's legitimately being proven in the course of a lot of this data that's coming out, but no one cares because it doesn't provide them with a narrative that they were right, that they're obviously incentivized to embrace.
No one cares because the media is not reporting on it to any extent.
True.
The way they were, reporting on pro-vaccine stuff a few years ago. It's just kind of being quieted away now. It's like, oh no, that's where it's over. Now we got to worry about what Trump's doing. You know what I mean? Or what this guy's doing or, whatever, and Trump is like the crazy, I'm like, did they put this guy in just because they know that the people that are very pro-Trump are psychotically pro-Trump and the people that are anti-Trump are psychotically anti-Trump and they know they're just all going to fight, instead of actually seeing what the hell's going on, because Trump campaigned, I'll even admit, I was like, I like some of the stuff he's saying, you know what I mean? And I like some of the people he's surrounding himself in. And then guess what? He gets in and nothing that he said is happening. You know what I mean? Like, day one, we're going to release JFK. We're going to release the Epstein files and this and that. And nothing's happening except you're just seeing these insane roundups and quasi military forces going and rounding people up on the streets with reckless abandon, you know what I mean? And it's like,
crazy.
Whatever your thing is on immigration, there's got to be better ways to handle all this shit, you know what I mean, other than deputizing fucking wild groups to do this stuff, you know what I mean? It's bananas out there right now, and it's like, but the people that are pro-Trump are still vehemently, not seeing the bad stuff, and the people that are, vehemently anti-Trump are just whatever. So I think he was put in place just because it was so polarizing that it's keeping everybody again fighting over this, but not looking over here. What's happening over here? It's just like we're fighting over here, but
larger than life personality.
Yeah.
But in the end, you can connect him directly back to the kosher mafia, Roy Cohn. Yeah. Human compromise, sexual blackmail, Jeffrey Epstein, Royal Casinos International, which is legitimately tied back to the Meyer Lansky syndicate. And essentially, when you realize the fact that you had Rupert Murdoch come out in the 90s, I believe, and this is the money manager for the Rockefellers, man, and the Rothschilds, right? This is who this is. He comes out and says that we made a decision to bail out Donald Trump because Trump was far more valuable to us alive than dead, meaning financially alive than financially dead. And so they needed his name, his larger than life personality to then attach to, which you attach this to the current agenda playing out in political terms. What you can accomplish is unprecedented.
Yep.
You know, and this is something that I think that when you begin to realize the fact that these you do not get as far as there is no way you're given the opportunity to be the face of the free world without being entirely compromised by special interest groups.
Yep.
And that I believe you can effectively tie into, not only do you see the individuals standing tall behind Trump like Peter Thiel and all of his acolytes in many ways, even Elon Musk. I mean, what his grandfather?
Oh, yeah.
Haldeman.
His mother, dude, like there's all kinds of craziness with him, you know.
His grandfather ran an organization called Technocracy Incorporated.
Yeah. And where are we at? You know what I mean? Like,
there was attempting to pursue universal basic income. And it's legitimately the exact same set of principles that Elon is fundamentally pursuing. And so in my mind, these are, and I feel like they are manufactured personalities created out of whole cloth by the intelligence apparatus to then pass off the keys into the private sector for plausible deniability. And this being the reason on how they can attempt to obviously pursue and reinforce and in many ways sort of insulate, the current strategy from being exposed, but not only being exposed, just as far as the pursuit in general.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing, but I'm very much in the camp of like a much more of a, as far as the modern tiptoe toward totalitarianism. I see no sort of disruption in the direction of the current path we're on in the form of a Trump administration. In my mind, it's only further facilitating that very path and almost fast tracking it, and if you can transcend politics and become larger than life as some sort of, maybe even if you consider what's happening in the Middle East, maybe even a manufactured false prophecy, right?
Yeah.
Facilitated by the state and the current political paradigm and power paradigm and apparatus in place that is attempting to not only infiltrate the spiritual realm of just religious ideology as a tool to effectively corral and let's say just utilize a very influential class of individuals in the United States, as far as just you consider, right, the Christian Zionist impact on U.S. culture in general at this very moment. You could definitely imagine the reality where this has been staged to effectively, compromise the direction and the path that we're on in this very moment. And if you could imagine kind of convincing individuals that not only is this path morally sound and ethical, but it is a divine path, right?
Yeah.
and it's been essentially manufactured by God. And now you have the right-wing God King who is effectively administering that very divine path and manufactured false prophecy. That's a scary, dangerous predicament to find yourself in. So I hope people can at least wake up to the reality that stop immortalizing and idolizing strangers who don't have your best interest at heart.
100%.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
This putting your faith in the wrong places, and
whether
be far more careful.
Whether it's Trump or Bernie Sanders, because that was the or any of them. I don't think anyone did that with Kamala, so that's why I picked Sanders.
No, me neither.
But anyway, dude, it was so good talking to you, man. I know you got other stuff to do. We're at 3 hours here, bro.
All right, brother.
Yeah, no, which is fucking great. And obviously, anytime you want to come on, we could talk about other stuff because we talked about 4,000 different things that each could be their own 2-hour, 3-hour episode.
And that's my fault, by the way. Anytime you want to specifically, I should have just focused on what we were originally going to talk about, and I just kind of went off on you on accident. But
no, but you know what? It kept coming back. Like anything that went off, then it showed the connection of how it came back. So it's good. Everyone who's listening, you might have to listen to this one twice, take notes. And there's a lot of stuff here for you to look down and to look into. I'll have all your contact stuff and your shows in the show notes so people don't have to, stop driving or whatever to write that stuff down. And I appreciate the time, man. I know you might have another episode to do tonight, like you said, with Sam and everybody. I think he's coming to Boston at some point, so I'm going to try and go out there and see that for
Awesome.
sure. But yeah, man, I'm going to end this. I'm going to end the recording right now, but I'm not going to hang up, so just hold on 1 second here.